Nobody prepares you for how ordinary everything feels right before your world shifts. February morning, downtown Cleveland, and I'm sorting through campaign metrics while the coffee maker gurgles its usual complaint. Marketing assistant, 4 months into the job after finishing my degree at 31. Finally getting my life together after years of bartending and bad decisions. Our office sits on the 7th floor of one of those interconnected downtown complexes where 3 buildings share a parking garage, and you can walk between them without ever going outside. Glass windows floor to ceiling on the east wall, perfect view of the Huntington building across the plaza. I remember thinking how the frost patterns on the windows looked like tiny cities, spreading across the glass while steam from my mug fogged up a small circle where I leaned against the window. Everything changed when the first patrol car screamed into the plaza below. Then another, then 6 more, all at different angles, officers jumping out with their weapons drawn and pointing at the Huntington building entrance. Diane from accounting pressed against the window next to me, her breath coming quick and shallow, leaving larger fog circles on the glass. We watched a SWAT van pull up, officers in full tactical gear pouring out like ants from a kicked hill. Someone behind us dropped their phone, and the crack against the tile floor made everyone jump. Through the frost and fog on the window, we could see people streaming out of Huntington's side exits, some running, some walking backward with their hands up, all of them being directed behind the police line by officers gesturing frantically. Our floor manager, Kevin, burst through the stairwell door, face flushed and tie crooked. "Active shooter in Huntington," he said, voice cracking on the word shooter. "Lock down, everybody away from the windows into the conference rooms now." But we stood there for another few seconds, mesmerized, watching the chaos below like it was happening on a screen instead of 70 feet away. A woman in a red coat stumbled out of Huntington's main entrance and collapsed on the sidewalk, 2 officers rushing to drag her behind a police car. That made it real. That made 27 of us scramble away from the windows, knocking over coffee cups and scattering papers, cramming ourselves into the 3 conference rooms on the west side of our floor. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with sudden sweat and fear. Conference room C became our world. 15 of us packed into a space meant for 8, sitting on the floor with our backs against the walls, knees drawn up, trying to make ourselves small. Nathan from IT had his police scanner app running on his phone, volume barely audible, crackling with codes and street names I recognized. "Suspect last seen heading toward underground parking level," the dispatcher said. Multiple buildings connected via lower level. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, that specific frequency that usually annoyed me during long meetings but now seemed like the only normal thing left. Diane sat next to me, her fingers wrapped around her ankles so tight I could see the white crescents of her knuckles. She kept whispering about her daughter at daycare, how she was supposed to pick her up at noon, how the daycare would call her ex-husband if she didn't show up. The scanner crackled again. Suspect entered Building 3 through maintenance access. Building 3. Our building. Nathan's hand trembled as he fumbled to mute the app, but we'd all heard it. The air in the conference room became thick, like breathing through wet cloth. Kevin stood up, pressing his ear against the door, then quickly sat back down when footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not running footsteps, just regular walking, which somehow made it worse. The footsteps paused right outside our door. I could hear breathing, or maybe it was my own breath bouncing off the wall behind me. The door handle rattled, just a small movement, like someone testing if it was locked. Diane grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging crescents into my skin. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and then the footsteps continued down the hall. We stayed frozen for what must have been 5 minutes but felt like hours before we heard it. A door slamming open somewhere down the hall, followed by shouting. Not police shouting, not commanding voices, but panic. High-pitched screaming from what sounded like the accounting department, maybe 40 feet from our conference room. Then a loud pop, another pop. The screaming stopped, replaced by a different kind of sound, muffled sobbing and whimpering. Heavy footsteps again, slower now, methodical. They stopped at each door, testing handles, getting closer. Someone in our room, I think it was Brandon from sales, started hyperventilating. Nathan clamped his hand over Brandon's mouth, both of them shaking. The footsteps reached the conference room next to ours, room B. The handle turned. That door wasn't locked. We heard chairs scraping, people scrambling, a woman's voice saying, "Please, please, please," and then 3 quick pops. Something heavy hit the shared wall between the conference rooms, sliding down with a sound that made my teeth ache. Our door handle turned. The lock held, but the door shuddered as something slammed against it. Again. Again. Each impact made the cheap wood flex inward. Kevin crawled toward the door on his stomach, reaching up to brace his hand against it, trying to hold it shut. Another slam. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I could see a crack forming, spreading like lightning through the white paint. Diane had her phone out, texting something, her thumb moving in quick jerks. "Love you, baby girl," I saw on her screen before she hit send. The slamming stopped. We could hear breathing on the other side of the door, ragged and heavy. Then footsteps again, but running this time, getting distant. Shouting from far away, professional voices this time. Police commands echoing through the hallway. More running, organized and tactical, boot falls in formation. 20 minutes passed before the police knocked on our door, identifying themselves, telling us to open slowly with our hands visible. They moved us out in a line, hands on our heads. Through hallways I walked every day but didn't recognize anymore. The accounting department door hung off its hinges. Dark stains on the gray carpet that my brain refused to process. In conference room B, paramedics worked on people I knew, had eaten lunch with, had complained about the broken printer with. They wouldn't let us look, kept us moving. But I saw Melissa's yellow cardigan on the floor, the one she wore every Monday. Outside, the February air hit my lungs like ice water. They herded us behind the police line where HR representatives with clipboards were taking names, checking us off lists, handing out emergency blankets that nobody needed but everybody took anyway. The news trucks were already there. Cameras pointed at us like we were a story instead of people. A detective took my statement while I stood there shivering. Not from cold, but from something else. Something that made my muscles contract without my permission. He asked if I recognized the shooter when they showed me a photo on his phone. Douglas Brennan, he said, worked for Huntington, recently terminated. The face meant nothing to me, just another downtown office worker, forgettable features, could have been anyone in the elevator. But then the detective asked about Jason Huang from our purchasing department. Did I know him well? Had Jason ever mentioned problems with anyone from Huntington? Did Jason seem worried lately? Jason, who hadn't been in conference room C with us. Jason, who I hadn't seen during the evacuation. The detective's questions painted a picture I didn't want to see. This wasn't random. Brennan had come for Jason specifically, through 3 buildings and 7 floors. They kept us in the Marriott lobby across the plaza for 6 hours while they processed the scene. Pizza appeared at some point, sitting untouched on folding tables while we sat in clusters. Some people crying, some staring at nothing, some calling family members over and over just to hear their voices. Diane finally reached her ex-husband, who picked up their daughter, and she cried so hard she threw up in a wastebasket. Nathan kept refreshing news sites on his phone, reading updates about our own experience like he needed confirmation it really happened. 3 dead in Huntington, 4 in our building, 11 injured. They didn't release names yet, but we knew. We knew Melissa was gone and Robert from conference room B, and Jason, who Brennan had hunted through 3 buildings. Around 8 that evening, they finally let us collect our cars from the parking garage, escorted in small groups, walking past yellow tape and evidence markers. Monday morning, 3 days later, we got an email from corporate. Subject line: Important safety update. The company had implemented new security measures, they said. Badge access restrictions, emergency protocol reviews, additional training seminars. They expressed condolences for the tragic incident that occurred in our building complex. Not our building specifically, but the building complex, like it was weather that had passed through instead of a man with a gun hunting one of our co-workers. No mention of Jason by name. No acknowledgement that an employee of ours was the target, that 6 other people died because Douglas Brennan knew Jason worked on our floor. The email ended with information about counseling services and a reminder that the office would reopen Wednesday with grief counselors available in the first-floor lobby. Business continuity, they called it. Essential to maintain operations and support our clients during this difficult time. I never went back. Couldn't walk through those doors knowing what I knew. What we all knew, but what the company wouldn't admit. That Jason had reported Brennan 2 years earlier when they'd worked together at Huntington. Something about contract irregularities and kickbacks. That Brennan blamed Jason for his termination. That he'd sent emails, made threats. That Jason had gone to our HR about it just 2 weeks before. That our company knew someone was hunting Jason and did nothing except suggest he park in a different section of the garage. Diane went back for 1 day, collected her things, and quit. Nathan lasted a week. Most of us scattered, found other jobs, other cities even. The company sent out quarterly safety newsletters for a while, reminding employees to report suspicious activity, to participate in active shooter drills, to remember that workplace safety was everyone's responsibility. They never mentioned February, never mentioned Jason. Like if they didn't acknowledge it, it somehow didn't happen in their building, to their employee, on their watch. Corporate life teaches you things they never mention in college. Like how the real danger in an office isn't missing deadlines or botched presentations. It's the people who smile while they tear you apart piece by piece. 26 and fresh into my first legitimate job at an insurance company downtown, I figured the worst part would be the commute, or maybe the endless spreadsheets. My dad spent 30 years at a manufacturing plant before retiring. Always came home with stories about harmless pranks and the occasional shouting match that ended with beers after work. What I witnessed during my 4th month there was something else entirely, something that still makes me check my food twice before taking a bite. The morning it happened started like any other, with that familiar buzz of keyboards and muted phone conversations. But by noon, everything we thought we knew about our coworkers had shifted into something darker. Veronica had been terrorizing that office for 7 years before I arrived, though terrorizing might be too strong a word for what she did, at least on paper. She was a senior analyst, not even management, but she carried herself like she had dirt on everyone from the janitor to the CEO. Walking past her desk felt like crossing a sniper's sight line. You never knew if today was the day she'd pick you as her target. She had mastered this particular brand of cruelty that left no evidence. No trail HR could follow. She'd praise your work while mentioning how impressed she was that someone from your background could adapt so quickly. Or she'd ask about your weekend plans right after discussing her ski trip to Aspen, knowing full well you were living paycheck to paycheck. The way she operated reminded me of those nature documentaries where the predator toys with its prey before the kill. Except Veronica never went for the kill. She preferred to keep her victims alive and suffering. That particular Monday started with Veronica targeting Bethany from accounting, a quiet woman who'd been with the company for 2 years and mostly kept to herself. Bethany had recently started wearing these bright scarves to work, beautiful handmade pieces that her sister sent from Guatemala, where she was doing humanitarian work. They were probably the most colorful things in our beige and gray office, little bursts of life that made Bethany stand out in a way she never had before. I was refilling my water bottle when I heard Veronica's voice carrying across the break room. That fake concerned tone she used right before she went for the jugular. She was asking Bethany about her scarf, running her fingers along the fabric, complimenting the craftsmanship while suggesting that such ethnic patterns were certainly bold choices for a conservative workplace. Then she pivoted, wondering aloud if Bethany was trying to distract from recent weight gain. How clever to draw the eye upward, though really, had she considered that the bright colors might be doing the opposite of what she intended? I watched Bethany's face crumble in real time, watched her fingers nervously touch the scarf that 5 minutes ago had made her feel beautiful, probably reminded her of her sister, gave her confidence. Veronica kept going, mentioning a weight loss program her friend had success with, pulling up before and after photos on her phone, insisting Bethany take down the number, all while maintaining that poisonous sweetness that made it impossible to call her out without looking like you were overreacting. Other people were in that break room, at least 4 of us, and we all just stood there, frozen, afraid to intervene because we knew we'd be next. Bethany mumbled something about needing to get back to her desk, and as she hurried past me, I saw tears streaming down her face. Veronica just smiled and stirred her coffee, satisfied, like a cat that had just torn apart a mouse for sport. That was Wednesday, and by Friday morning, Veronica would be on the floor of that same break room, gasping for air while her face swelled up like a balloon. Wednesday afternoon dragged on with this heavy tension you could practically taste in the recycled office air. Bethany didn't come back after lunch, sent an email about feeling sick, and we all knew exactly what kind of sick she meant. I kept replaying the break room scene in my head while trying to focus on insurance claims, but my mind kept drifting to all the times I'd witnessed similar attacks. There was Tom from IT who stopped wearing his vintage band shirts after Veronica suggested he was trying too hard to seem young and hip for someone balding at 34. There was Monica, who used to bring homemade Filipino food, until Veronica complained about the smell and started a whole discussion about professional courtesy in shared spaces. Each person dimmed a little after their encounter with Veronica, like she was slowly draining the color from our office one victim at a time. The worst part was how she'd act completely normal afterward, chatting about weekend plans or asking for recipe recommendations as if she hadn't just destroyed someone's confidence an hour earlier. I need to tell you about Friday morning because even now, months later, I can still see every detail like it's burned into my retinas. Veronica always ate lunch at exactly noon, had this whole ritual where she'd heat up her meal prep container, usually some trendy diet food she'd post on Instagram, arrange everything perfectly on her plate, and eat at the round table by the window. She kept her lunch in the same spot in the fridge every day, top shelf, left corner, with her initials written in purple Sharpie on the lid. That Friday, she grabbed her container like always, heated up what looked like quinoa salad with grilled chicken and pine nuts, and sat down with her phone propped up against her water bottle, probably scrolling through social media or reading those toxic productivity blogs she loved to quote. I was microwaving my sad frozen burrito when she took her first bite, and then her second, and then everything went sideways fast. First, she started coughing. Not like when you swallow wrong, but these deep, rattling coughs that made everyone in the break room turn around. Her hand went to her throat, and I saw her eyes go wide, real fear replacing that usual smugness for the first time since I'd known her. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, crashing against the floor, and that's when I noticed her lips were already swelling, turning this unnatural shade of purple red. She tried to speak but only managed these horrible wheezing sounds, like air being forced through a straw that was getting smaller and smaller. Her face started changing shape right in front of us, her eyelids puffing up until she could barely see, hives spreading across her neck like someone was painting them on in real time. She fumbled for her purse, knocking her perfectly arranged lunch across the table, quinoa and chicken scattering everywhere, and that's when she collapsed, her knees just giving out like someone had cut her strings. The next few minutes were absolute chaos, the kind that makes time move both too fast and too slow simultaneously. Phil from sales was already on the phone with 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what was happening, while Gloria from HR dropped to her knees beside Veronica, asking if anyone knew if she had allergies, if she carried an EpiPen. Veronica was making these terrifying, gasping sounds, her whole body jerking with the effort to breathe, and her face had swollen so much she was almost unrecognizable. Someone found an EpiPen in her purse, thank God, and Gloria jabbed it into her thigh right through her dress pants, but it barely seemed to help. I stood there holding my half-heated burrito, unable to move, unable to look away from this woman who had terrorized us for years, now fighting for every breath. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 6 or 7 minutes, and they worked on her with this urgent efficiency that made it clear how serious this was. They got her on a stretcher, oxygen mask over her swollen face, and rushed her out while we all stood there in stunned silence, the break room still smelling like microwaved quinoa and fear. After the ambulance left, we all just stood there staring at the mess on the floor, the overturned chair, her phone still propped against her water bottle with some influencer's perfect life frozen on the screen. Gloria was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone knew what Veronica was allergic to, and that's when the reality of what just happened started sinking in. Someone had put something in her food, something they knew would trigger this reaction, and we all knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Security showed up about 20 minutes later, started asking questions, taking photos of the break room, bagging up what was left of her lunch. But the damage was already done. The cameras in the break room had been down for 3 weeks, something about a system upgrade that kept getting delayed, and everyone knew it. HR sent us all home early, told us to expect a call over the weekend, but that call never came, at least not the kind we were expecting. Monday morning arrived with an email from corporate, one of those carefully worded messages that said everything and nothing at the same time. Veronica was recovering, would be taking an extended medical leave, and the company was conducting a thorough investigation into what they called an unfortunate incident. They reminded us about food allergy awareness, announced new protocols for food storage in common areas, and stressed that tampering with anyone's food was not only against company policy, but also illegal. What they didn't mention was that Bethany had submitted her resignation Friday afternoon, effective immediately, about 2 hours after Veronica was taken away in that ambulance. They also didn't mention that the security footage from the hallway leading to the break room, the only cameras that were working, showed at least 15 people going in and out that morning, including Bethany, who had supposedly called in sick. The investigation went on for weeks, interviews with everyone, polygraph tests that were voluntary but didn't feel voluntary, and through it all, this suffocating cloud of suspicion that made every interaction feel loaded with hidden meaning. The office changed after that Friday, transformed into something unrecognizable, even though all the furniture stayed in the same places. People started eating at their desks exclusively, keeping their food in locked containers or mini fridges they bought themselves, treating the communal kitchen like it was contaminated. Conversations became purely transactional. Nobody wanted to risk saying something that might be taken the wrong way, might make them a target for whoever had done this to Veronica. The scariest part was how many people I heard whispering that while they didn't condone what happened, they understood it, and that terrified me more than the actual poisoning. We all knew Veronica had pushed someone past their breaking point, but the fact that someone in our office, someone who sat through meetings with us and made small talk by the printer, had deliberately tried to kill her, or at least seriously harm her, that knowledge sat in our stomachs like a stone. Tom from IT quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't handle the atmosphere anymore, and Monica transferred to the branch across town, taking a pay cut just to get away from what our office had become. Veronica never came back to work, officially took early retirement with a generous settlement that came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, or at least that's what we heard through the gossip network that somehow survived even in our new culture of silence. Bethany disappeared completely, her LinkedIn deleted, her social media accounts gone like she'd never existed at all, though sometimes I wonder if she's out there somewhere, finally free from Veronica's shadow but carrying the weight of what she might have done. The company brought in consultants, team-building experts, even a workplace therapist, but nothing could fix what had broken that Friday. I lasted another 3 months before I found a new job, and during my exit interview, when they asked why I was leaving, I just said I needed a change of scenery. What I didn't say was that every time I opened the office fridge, I thought about how easy it had been for someone to nearly kill a coworker, how we'd all watched Veronica torment people for years and done nothing, how in the end, we became the kind of workplace where attempted murder felt like justice to someone. Now I work from home, make my own lunch, And sometimes, late at night, I still think about that moment when Veronica's eyes went wide with fear, when she realized someone she'd pushed too far had pushed back in the worst possible way, and I wonder if she ever understood that she'd created the very monster that almost killed her. Everyone at the warehouse knew me as the guy who actually gave a damn about inventory accuracy. 26 candles on my last birthday cake, 4 years since college, and I was still scanning packages at Midwest Logistics, while my roommate from freshman year was already pulling 6 figures at some tech startup. But I had a plan, and that Tuesday in early November was supposed to be when everything changed. My supervisor Craig had been dangling this operations coordinator position for months, dropping hints during smoke breaks, telling me to be patient, that good things come to those who wait. When he finally called me into his office that afternoon, right after the lunch trucks finished loading, I thought my persistence had paid off. Craig's office sat in the corner of the warehouse, one of those prefab structures with thin walls and a window overlooking the loading docks. He had this habit of keeping the blinds half closed, creating these weird shadows across his desk that made everything feel like a confession booth. I remember knocking twice, hearing his voice call me in, and finding him leaning back in his chair with his feet up on the desk, work boots still caked with yesterday's mud. He smiled when he saw me, but it was different from his usual grin, the kind he'd flash when telling dirty jokes by the forklift. This smile stayed too long on his face, like he was savoring something before swallowing it. "Close the door behind you, champ," he said, and I did. Even though we usually kept doors open during one-on-ones, company policy about transparency and all that. The conversation started normal enough, Craig asking about my weekend, whether I caught the game Sunday night, regular boss small talk that usually meant he was warming up to something bigger. I sat in the metal folding chair across from his desk, the one with the uneven leg that rocked if you shifted your weight, and waited for him to get to the point about the coordinator position. He talked about the company's growth, how corporate was impressed with our numbers, how he needed someone he could trust in a management role. Then he stood up, walked around the desk, and sat on its edge, right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen on his breath. "You want this promotion, right?" he asked. And when I nodded, probably too eagerly, he continued, "Good, because I've been watching you, and I think you understand what loyalty means around here." At first, I thought he meant staying late without overtime complaints, covering shifts when people called in sick, the usual workplace dedication speech every boss gives before adding more to your plate. But Craig kept going, explaining how loyalty meant understanding that some conversations never leave his office, that good employees know when to speak up and when to stay quiet, that gratitude wasn't just saying thank you, but showing it in ways that mattered. His hand landed on my shoulder while he talked, heavy and warm through my polo shirt, and he squeezed just hard enough to make his point without leaving marks. "The thing about opportunities," he said, leaning closer, "is they come with expectations, and I need to know you're mature enough to handle those expectations without making things complicated." The fluorescent light above us hummed and flickered, casting his face in and out of shadow, and I noticed for the first time that he'd locked the door after I closed it. I tried to lean back in the wobbly chair, create some distance, but there was nowhere to go, just Craig's presence filling the small office like smoke from a fire you can't locate. He started talking about other employees who'd disappointed him, people who'd confused professional boundaries with personal attacks, who didn't understand that success required sacrifice and flexibility. His examples got more specific, mentioning Amy from receiving who'd filed a complaint last year before suddenly transferring to the night shift, then quitting altogether. "She didn't understand the game," he said, his fingers drumming against the desk beside my arm, each tap deliberate and measured. "But you're smarter than that, aren't you? You've been here long enough to know how things really work, how sometimes you need to trust your supervisor's judgment, even when it doesn't make complete sense at first." The promotion paperwork was right there on his desk. I could see my name typed on the top form, the salary increase that would finally let me move out of my studio apartment, maybe even start paying down those student loans faster. Craig followed my eyes to the papers and grinned wider, picking up the stack and fanning them out like a poker hand. $48,000 a year, he said, plus benefits, plus my personal mentorship, which is worth more than money if you're smart enough to appreciate it. He put the papers in his desk drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he pulled out his personal phone, not the company one, and asked for my number, said he preferred texting for urgent matters. That email left too much of a paper trail for efficient communication. When I hesitated, his expression shifted, not angry exactly, but disappointed, like a teacher catching a promising student cheating on a test. Trust, he said slowly, is a two-way street, and right now you're standing at a crossroads. I gave him my number, watched him type it into his phone with thick fingers that seemed to take forever hitting each digit, and immediately felt my own phone buzz in my pocket. His first text was already there. Good choice. He told me the promotion would be official by Friday, but there were some training sessions he wanted to handle personally, after hours, to make sure I was ready for the responsibility. The way he said after hours made my chest tighten, but I nodded, told myself this was just how advancement worked, that everyone had to pay their dues somehow. Craig stood up, finally giving me room to breathe, and walked to the door, unlocking it with a casual motion like the last 20 minutes had been a normal performance review. "Oh, one more thing," he said, turning back to face me. "This conversation stays between us, understood? Corporate doesn't need to know every detail about how I develop my team, and neither does anyone else in the warehouse. Discretion is the first lesson in management." That night, the texts started coming around 10:30, just as I was getting ready for bed. First one was innocent enough, asking if I could come in an hour early tomorrow to review some paperwork. Then another at 11, reminding me to wear something presentable for our morning meeting. By midnight, he'd sent 4 more messages, each one slightly more personal than the last, asking about my living situation, whether I had a girlfriend, if I ever felt lonely working so much. I didn't respond to any of them, just lay there staring at my phone screen lighting up in the dark, each buzz making my apartment feel smaller and smaller. The last text came at 1:15 in the morning, just 2 words that made sleep impossible. "You awake?" I turned off my phone completely, something I never did in case of family emergencies, and spent the rest of the night listening to every sound in my building, wondering if that was a car door slamming or just my neighbor coming home late. Wednesday morning came too fast and not fast enough. That weird paradox of dreading something while desperately wanting it to be over. I arrived at my usual time, not the hour early Craig had requested, and found my schedule completely rearranged on the assignment board. Instead of my regular receiving duties, I was assigned to solo inventory in the back warehouse, the section we called the dungeon because of its broken lights and distance from everyone else. Craig was waiting there when I arrived, leaning against a stack of pallets with a clipboard, acting like it was perfectly normal for a supervisor to personally oversee routine inventory counts. "Sleep well?" he asked, and the way he emphasized the word sleep made it clear he knew exactly when I'd turned off my phone. For the next 3 hours, he shadowed me through the aisles, never quite touching, but always close enough that I could feel his presence, asking questions about my counting methods, my organizational preferences, whether I preferred working alone or with a partner. The pattern established itself over the next 2 weeks like a noose tightening one twist at a time. If I didn't respond to his late-night texts fast enough, my schedule would mysteriously change, putting me on the loading dock during the coldest hours or assigning me to clean the break room during my usual lunch period. When I did respond, keeping things professional and brief, he'd find reasons to call me into his office, each meeting a little longer than the last, each conversation pushing boundaries a little further. He started sharing details about his divorce, his custody battle, how lonely leadership could be, always punctuating these confessions with comments about trust and loyalty and understanding. Other employees began avoiding me, not obviously, but in that way people distanced themselves from someone marked by authority's attention. Even Larry, who'd trained me 4 years ago and usually had a joke for everything, stopped making eye contact when we passed in the aisles. By the third week, I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep a night, jumping at every notification sound, screening calls from numbers I didn't recognize because Craig had started calling from different phones when I didn't answer his personal cell. My work performance tanked, simple inventory counts taking twice as long because I couldn't focus, couldn't stop checking exits, couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching even when his office door was closed. The promotion paperwork never materialized, of course, though Craig kept mentioning it was in process whenever I tried to bring it up. Instead, he started suggesting we discuss my future over drinks after work, maybe dinner on Saturday to really dive deep into career planning. When I declined, citing a family obligation that didn't exist, he assigned me to work that exact Saturday. Over time, I couldn't afford to refuse given my student loan payment was due. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in December when I finally went to HR, sitting across from Linda in her clean, organized office that felt like a different universe from Craig's cave. I told her everything, showed her the texts on my phone, explained the schedule changes, the isolation, the constant surveillance disguised as mentorship. She took notes, nodded sympathetically, asked if I'd explicitly told Craig to stop contacting me outside of work hours. When I said no, not in those exact words, her expression shifted slightly, professionally neutral but somehow dismissive. She explained that Craig's communication style might be unconventional, but without explicit harassment or discrimination, it fell into a gray area of management discretion. The texts I showed her were gone when I looked again during our meeting, somehow deleted from my phone even though I knew I hadn't touched them. Linda suggested I document everything going forward, maintain professional boundaries, and come back if anything concrete happened. Craig knew about my HR visit before I even made it back to the warehouse floor. I could see it in his face when he passed me near the loading dock, that particular smile that meant he was 3 steps ahead and enjoying the view. That night, no texts came, no calls, nothing but silence that felt louder than all his previous messages combined. The next morning, I found myself assigned to work with a crew transferring to our satellite facility 40 miles away, a temporary assignment that would last indefinitely according to the schedule. My access card stopped working for the main office area. IT said it was a system glitch they'd fix eventually. The promotion posting disappeared from the internal job board, and when I asked about it, I was told the position had been eliminated due to restructuring. Coworkers who'd previously just avoided me now looked at me with something between pity and relief. Like I was a cautionary tale they were grateful not to be living. I quit 2 weeks later, walking out in the middle of a shift because I couldn't stand another day of exile, another night of wondering when the silence would break, another morning of checking my phone for messages that never came but somehow still controlled my entire existence. No reference, no unemployment eligibility, just gone with 4 years of my life reduced to a gap on my resume I still struggle to explain in interviews. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Craig had promoted someone new to operations coordinator, a young guy fresh from college who apparently understood the importance of loyalty and gratitude. They said Craig keeps a photo from the kid's promotion ceremony on his desk, right where anyone sitting in that wobbly metal chair would have to see it. Sometimes I still wake up at 1:15 in the morning, phone in hand before I'm fully conscious, checking for messages that aren't there from a number I blocked but memorized, waiting for a conversation that ended but never really stopped. Insurance adjusting isn't glamorous work, but after graduating college in 2011, I needed something stable, while everyone else was still recovering from the recession. Our office in downtown Portland only had 12 employees, tucked into the 4th floor of a building that used to house a department store in the 70s. Most mornings, I'd arrive around 8:30, grab coffee from the break room that always smelled faintly of burnt popcorn, and settle into my cubicle near the window. It was predictable, comfortable even, the kind of job where you knew everyone's lunch orders and whose kid had soccer practice on Wednesdays. That February morning when Harold started, I remember thinking how exhausted he looked, like someone had drained all the color from his face and forgotten to put it back. Harold took the empty desk 3 cubicles down from mine, the one that had been vacant since Carolyn retired. During his first week, he kept entirely to himself, eating lunch at his desk while staring at his computer screen, never joining our Friday afternoon conversations about weekend plans. I noticed him because of how deliberately unnoticeable he tried to be, if that makes sense. He wore the same style of gray polo shirt every day, just in different shades, and moved through the office like he was afraid of taking up too much space. About 2 weeks in, I found him in the break room during lunch, heating up a single serving of instant soup, and something about the way he stood there watching the microwave timer count down made my chest tight with recognition. I knew that posture, that hollow look. My brother had worn it for months after his own marriage fell apart. Maybe that's why I started bringing extra portions of dinner leftovers, casually mentioning I'd made too much pasta, or that my slow cooker recipes always served 6, even though I lived alone. Harold would hesitate at first, his fingers drumming against his desk before accepting, always insisting he'd bring something next time to make it even. He never did, but I didn't mind. We started eating together in the break room, and gradually he began sharing fragments of his story. His ex-wife had kept the house in Beaverton. Their daughter visited every other weekend, and he was renting a studio apartment near the river that got terrible water pressure, but had a nice view of the bridge. Normal divorce stuff, painful but manageable, the kind of life readjustment thousands of people navigate every year. By April, our lunch routine had evolved into something comfortable. Harold would wait for me by the elevator at noon, holding the door even when I was running late from a phone call. He started contributing to conversations, offering surprisingly funny observations about our coworkers' habits, like how Martin always cleared his throat exactly 3 times before answering his phone, or how Sheila rearranged her desk plants based on her mood. I genuinely enjoyed his company. When he mentioned he'd never tried the Mediterranean place 2 blocks over, I suggested we walk there on Friday, and his face lit up like I'd offered him a winning lottery ticket. That should have registered as unusual, that intensity of reaction. But loneliness can make people grateful for small kindnesses. I understood that, or thought I did. The text messages started innocently enough. Harold had asked for my number after I'd offered to send him a recipe for the lemon chicken I'd brought one day, and initially his messages were sparse, appropriate. A thank you for lunch, a joke about something that happened in the office, a picture of his attempt at the recipe that had turned out surprisingly well. But by early May, I was waking up to multiple messages every morning. Photos of his breakfast with comments about what I might be eating, observations about the weather and whether I'd dressed warm enough, links to articles about topics I'd mentioned once in passing weeks ago. He'd apparently cataloged every casual comment I'd made. When I mentioned liking jazz during one lunch conversation, I received daily YouTube links to obscure jazz recordings at exactly 6 a.m., each with a lengthy paragraph about why this particular piece reminded him of something I'd said or done. One Monday in mid-May, I decided to eat lunch at my desk to catch up on paperwork, sending Harold a quick text that I couldn't make our usual break room meeting. Within 3 minutes, he was standing at my cubicle, holding 2 sandwiches from the deli downstairs, insisting he'd bought too much by accident. When I explained I really needed to focus on work, his jaw tightened in this peculiar way, like he was physically holding words inside his mouth. He set the sandwich on my desk anyway, then pulled up a chair from an empty cubicle and sat there eating his lunch while I worked, occasionally commenting on my typing speed or asking about the claim I was reviewing. Every time I glanced up, he was watching me, not eating, just watching with this slight smile that made my scalp prickle. After that day, eating lunch alone became impossible. He'd always appear with food, acting like we'd planned it. I started leaving the office for lunch, telling everyone I had errands to run or appointments to keep. Harold would text asking where I was, if everything was okay, if he'd done something wrong. 15, 20 messages in an hour. When I returned, he'd be waiting by my desk with this wounded expression, asking why I hadn't responded. Didn't I see his messages? I tried being direct but gentle, explaining that I needed some space, that friendship required boundaries. He nodded along, apologizing profusely, promising to dial it back. The next morning, there were 36 roses on my desk with a card that read, "For being such a patient friend," and my coworkers were all smiling and making assumptions that made me want to crawl under my desk. When I told Harold the roses were inappropriate, he looked genuinely confused, insisted they were just a friendly gesture, that I was reading too much into it. Martin overheard and joked that I should be flattered, and Harold latched onto that immediately, repeating it whenever I tried to establish distance. The breaking point came on a Saturday in early June. I was at the farmer's market with my sister when I spotted Harold 3 stalls behind us, poorly hidden behind a display of hanging plants. When we moved to the next vendor, he followed. When we stopped for coffee, he sat 2 tables away with a newspaper held up to his face like some cartoon detective. My sister noticed him too, asked if that was the coworker I'd mentioned had been getting clingy. Clingy didn't begin to cover it anymore. I confronted him right there, walked straight to his table while my sister filmed on her phone just in case. Harold's face crumpled like a child caught stealing candy. He swore it was a coincidence, that he came to this market every Saturday, had been coming for years, but when I asked him to name a single vendor or what he'd bought, he just stared at me with those pale gray eyes getting wet around the edges, then stood up and walked away without another word. I thought that public embarrassment might have finally gotten through to him. Monday at work, Harold wasn't at his desk. Neither was his computer, his coffee mug, the small cactus he kept by his monitor. For one beautiful moment, I thought he'd quit, maybe realized he'd crossed too many lines. But then I found out from Sheila that he'd requested to move to the 3rd floor, told management he needed a quieter workspace to focus better. The relief I felt was physical, like someone had removed a weight from my chest. For 2 weeks, everything felt normal again. I could eat lunch in peace, check my phone without finding dozens of messages, walk to my car after work without constantly scanning the parking lot. I even started staying late again to catch up on the backlog I'd accumulated while trying to avoid Harold. That false sense of security was exactly what he was counting on, I realize now. The notes started appearing on my car in late June, tucked under the windshield wiper like parking tickets. The first one was just a single line, "I miss our lunches." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, that cramped, precise script I'd seen on countless forms. I threw it away, didn't mention it to anyone. The next day there was another. "You looked nice in the blue dress yesterday." I hadn't seen Harold at all that day, hadn't even known he was watching. They escalated quickly after that. Details about what I'd eaten for dinner, visible through my apartment window. Comments about the TV shows I watched, the glow apparently visible from the street. Observations about my morning routine, what time I turned on the bathroom light, how long my showers lasted. I filed a report with building security, but they said without proof it was Harold, without any explicit threats. There wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the garage. The police said essentially the same thing when I went to them with a folder full of the notes. Then my mother started getting Facebook friend requests from someone claiming to be my boyfriend, using photos stolen from my Instagram, but with Harold's face poorly photoshopped over whoever I'd been standing next to. My cousin received LinkedIn messages about what a wonderful couple Harold and I made, how we were planning to move in together soon. My landlord called asking about my fiancé who'd stopped by to look at adding his name to the lease, describing Harold perfectly, even though I'd never once brought him to my apartment building. I changed my locks, installed a doorbell camera, started parking in different spots each day. I documented everything, built a case file that would make any detective proud. HR at work said they'd spoken to Harold about maintaining professional boundaries, but since nothing was happening on company property anymore, their hands were tied. I was drowning in bureaucracy while Harold was systematically inserting himself into every corner of my life, and everyone around me seemed to think I was overreacting to someone who was just lonely or probably harmless. The night everything unraveled was a Wednesday in July. one of those humid Portland evenings where the air feels too thick to breathe properly. I'd stayed late at the office finishing a complex claim, the building mostly empty except for the cleaning crew. Around 9:30, I finally packed up and headed to the parking garage, my keys between my fingers like I'd been doing for weeks. My car was the only one left on level 2 besides a maintenance van, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. As I approached my car, I noticed something off about my driver's side door. It was unlocked, slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered the click of the locks when I'd left that morning. My phone was already in my hand, 911 pre-dialed, when I heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. Not running, just walking steadily, purposefully. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as Harold emerged from the shadows, carrying a box of my things from my desk. Items I hadn't even noticed were missing. He stood there in the harsh garage lighting, looking confused and hurt, like I was the one behaving strangely. I called 911 right there, windows up, doors locked, while Harold stood 5 feet away from my car holding that box like some demented delivery man. He kept talking, though I couldn't hear the words through the glass, his mouth moving frantically. His free hand gesturing at the box, at me, at himself. The police arrived within 10 minutes that felt like hours, and Harold actually smiled when he saw them, like they'd come to mediate a simple misunderstanding. While the officers separated us for questioning, one of them went back into the building with security to review the footage from the past week. What they found made even the veteran cop's face go pale. Harold had been entering the building almost every night using a copied key card, sitting at my desk for hours in the dark, going through my drawers, my computer, even eating the snacks I kept in my bottom drawer. The footage from just 3 hours earlier showed him at my desk, while I was in the conference room down the hall, completely unaware. He'd been doing this for weeks, maybe longer, living some twisted fantasy where my workspace was his, where my life was his to examine and document. They arrested Harold that night for breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft. During the investigation, they found journals at his apartment filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, printed screenshots of every social media post I'd ever made, photos of me taken from distances with a telephoto lens, and worst of all, a wedding planning book where he'd pasted my face next to his in various venue brochures. He'd already put deposits down at 2 locations for the following spring. The restraining order went through immediately, and Harold was terminated from the company the next day. He pled guilty to avoid trial, got 18 months probation and mandatory counseling. I never went back to that office. I couldn't sit at that desk knowing he'd been there in the darkness, touching my things, breathing in my space, pretending we shared something that existed only in his fractured mind. I moved to a different neighborhood, changed jobs, deleted most of my social media. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Harold had moved to Idaho to live with his elderly parents. I still check my rearview mirror too often, still feel my chest tighten when I see gray polo shirts, still triple check my locks before bed. Some violations of trust leave marks that don't fade. They just become part of your routine, woven into the fabric of how you move through the world. I started the engine and drove straight to the police station, Harold's figure shrinking in my rearview mirror, still standing in that same spot holding that box. The officers took my statement, said they'd increase patrols around my apartment, suggested a restraining order. But what happened next changed everything. The next morning, our head of security, Walter, pulled me aside with his laptop, his face pale and serious. He'd been reviewing footage from the past month after my parking garage incident, going through the overnight recordings that normally nobody checked. What he showed me made my entire body go cold. There was Harold, using a key card to enter the building at 2, 3 in the morning, multiple times a week. The cameras showed him going to the 4th floor, to our old department. He'd sit at my desk for hours in the complete darkness, just sitting in my chair, going through my drawers, typing on my keyboard, even though the computer was off. In one recording from just 3 nights ago, he'd brought a blanket and pillow, sleeping under my desk until 5 a.m. before leaving through the stairwell. Walter had checked the keycard logs. Harold had reported his card stolen weeks ago and gotten a replacement, but had clearly kept the original and been using it for his midnight visits. The police arrested Harold that afternoon at his apartment, where they found notebooks filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, hundreds of photos of me taken without my knowledge, and most disturbingly, a set of keys they matched to my apartment, copies he'd somehow had made, though thankfully my recent lock change had rendered them useless. He'd been entering the office for 6 weeks, they determined, starting right after he'd moved to the 3rd floor. The security footage also revealed he'd installed something under my desk, a tiny recording device that picked up my phone conversations, which explained how he knew so much about my schedule and personal life. Harold was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and unlawful surveillance. He took a plea deal for 2 years in prison and a permanent restraining order. I never went back to that office. The company transferred me to their Seattle branch with a small settlement to avoid any liability issues, and I started fresh in a new city. That was 3 years ago. I still check my rearview mirror too often, still feel my chest tighten when I see someone in a gray polo shirt, still can't shake the image of him sleeping under my desk, curled up in the exact spot where my feet would go, like he was trying to exist in the negative space of my life. April has always been my favorite month in Seattle, when the rain finally starts to let up, and you can actually see Mount Rainier from the office windows. I'd been working at Holloway Architecture for about 18 months, long enough to know everyone's coffee order and which printer would jam if you looked at it wrong. We were a small firm, just 12 of us crammed into the 7th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of place where everyone wore multiple hats, and the holiday party was just ordering Thai food and drinking wine from coffee mugs. Most days felt like working with an extended family, which made what happened next feel like such a profound betrayal that even now, 2 years later, I still check every smoke detector in every room I enter. It was Charlotte who found it first, though she didn't realize what she was looking at initially. She'd been standing on the toilet seat trying to open the bathroom window that had been painted shut since probably the Clinton administration, when she noticed the smoke detector above the stalls looked different from the one in the hallway. The LED light that should have been green was red, and there was this tiny black circle in the center that definitely wasn't there on the other detectors. She mentioned it to me during lunch, more curious than concerned, wondering if maybe building maintenance had upgraded just that one for some reason. But something about it nagged at me all afternoon, that little detail scratching at the back of my mind like a song you can't quite remember. Around 3 that afternoon, I couldn't focus on the residential plans spread across my desk anymore. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I walked to the women's bathroom, but I locked the door behind me anyway. Standing on the same toilet seat Charlotte had used, I got my first close look at that smoke detector. My stomach did this weird flip when I saw it properly, because that black circle wasn't just different, it was a camera lens. I actually laughed at first, this nervous, disbelieving sound that echoed off the tile walls, because things like this happened in news stories about gas stations or sketchy motels, not in your own office where you knew everyone by their kids' names and their favorite basketball teams. I climbed down and sat right there on the bathroom floor for a minute, trying to process what this meant. The detector had been there since before I started. I was sure of it, which meant someone had been recording every woman in our office for God knows how long. Every time we'd adjusted our clothes, fixed our makeup, had private phone conversations during rough days, changed after cycling to work in the morning, someone had been watching. The violation of it hit me in waves, each realization worse than the last, and I had to grip the edge of the sink to stop myself from either screaming or throwing up. Charlotte was still at her desk when I practically dragged her into the conference room, my voice shaking as I told her what I'd found. Her face went through this progression of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to a kind of horror that made her whole body seem to shrink into itself. We called in Priya, our office manager, and watched her normally composed demeanor completely crumble as she processed what we were telling her. Within an hour, All 5 women in the office were huddled in that conference room, speaking in hushed voices like we were afraid the walls might be listening too. The men were still working at their desks, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in our professional lives. Priya said we needed to call the police immediately, but first she wanted to document everything. She put on latex gloves from the first aid kit, stood on a chair she'd brought from the conference room, and carefully unscrewed the fake smoke detector. The thing came away from the ceiling easily, too easily, with just a battery pack attached to the back and a small memory card tucked into a slot on the side. Looking at it sitting there on the conference table, this cheap piece of hardware that you could probably buy online for $30 made everything feel surreal and impossibly sorted at the same time. We could see the real smoke detector underneath where the fake had been mounted, painted over like it had been covered for years. The police arrived within the hour, 2 officers who seemed almost as uncomfortable as we were. They bagged the device as evidence and took statements from each of us separately, asking when we'd first noticed anything unusual, who had access to the bathroom, whether we'd seen anyone acting suspiciously. The younger officer, a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, kept apologizing like she was personally responsible for what had happened to us. While they were processing the scene, Walter, our senior partner, finally noticed the commotion and came over to ask what was going on. I'll never forget the way his face changed when Priya explained. This slow-motion collapse from confusion to shock, to something that looked almost like panic. By 5:30, everyone knew. The men in the office stood around in awkward clusters, not making eye contact with any of us, like they'd all been collectively accused of something. Walter called an emergency meeting, his voice cracking as he promised a full investigation. Said he'd already called our building management and our IT contractor to check if anyone had requested access to that bathroom recently. He kept running his hand through what was left of his gray hair, repeating that in 30 years of running this firm, nothing like this had ever happened. But here's what made my skin crawl. Every single man in that room had a key card that could access the women's bathroom after hours for maintenance or emergencies, a detail I'd never thought twice about until that moment. The forensics tech who came the next day was this methodical woman who spent 3 hours examining the memory card while we all pretended to work. She told us the footage went back 14 months, with motion-activated recordings that captured everything during business hours. 14 months of private moments, stored on a card smaller than a quarter. She said whoever did this had been downloading the footage regularly, probably monthly, replacing the batteries at the same time. The level of planning made me physically ill. The idea that someone had marked their calendar for their monthly violation ritual, probably stayed late on a Friday or came in on a weekend when no one would notice. Charlotte quit that same week, didn't even work out her 2 weeks' notice, just packed her desk and left. I couldn't blame her. The rest of us tried to maintain some normalcy, but it was impossible. Every conversation felt loaded, every interaction suspect. We started using the bathroom on the 3rd floor, taking the stairs just to avoid running into the men from our office in the elevator. Priya installed a new lock on the women's bathroom that required a special code only the 5 of us knew, but it felt like putting a band-aid on a severed artery. The damage was already done, the trust completely shattered, and we all knew one of the 7 men we worked with every day had done this to us. HR brought in a specialist from some consulting firm, a woman in an expensive suit, who conducted individual interviews with everyone, asking probing questions about office dynamics and whether we'd noticed any inappropriate behavior. She set up a tip line, promised complete anonymity, talked about implementing new security protocols and mandatory training sessions. Walter sent out daily emails about the investigation's progress, which was basically no progress at all. The police said without DNA evidence or fingerprints, which the person had been careful not to leave, and without any distinguishing features in the footage that could identify who installed it, they had very little to go on. The memory card was a generic brand sold everywhere, the device ordered online with no way to trace the buyer. 3 weeks passed in this suffocating limbo. We'd get updates that led nowhere, promises that something would be done, assurances that they were taking this seriously, but every day we had to walk into that office, sit across from our male colleagues in meetings, pretend to collaborate on projects while wondering which one had watched us in our most vulnerable moments. I started having dreams about it. Would wake up at 3 in the morning convinced I could feel eyes on me even in my own apartment. The worst part was how normal everyone acted, how they all expressed the right amount of outrage and sympathy, every single one of them playing the part of the shocked and supportive colleague perfectly. Then came the Monday morning that changed everything. I arrived early, around 7, hoping to get some work done before everyone else showed up and the pretense of normalcy began. The office was quiet, just the hum of computers that never got turned off, and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I went to make coffee in the kitchen, and when I came back to my desk, Priya was standing in the hallway outside the women's bathroom, her face pale as printer paper. She had her phone in one hand and was gesturing frantically with the other for me to come over. My coffee mug slipped from my hand when I saw what she was looking at. Brown liquid spreading across the carpet in a pattern I'd still see weeks later every time I closed my eyes. There was a new smoke detector installed above the toilet. Same spot, same angle. But this one was white instead of beige, with a tiny green LED that blinked every few seconds like it was winking at us. The original fake one was still in police evidence. The real one was still painted over on the ceiling, which meant someone had brought in a third device and installed it over the weekend. Someone who still had access to the building, who knew the investigation had stalled, who was confident enough or desperate enough to do it again. Priya's hands shook as she called Walter, then the police, then started taking photos from every angle. I just stood there, frozen, because this meant the person wasn't some outside contractor or former employee like we'd been hoping. They were still here, still watching, and they wanted us to know they weren't going to stop. The police arrived faster this time, and they weren't playing around. They sealed off the entire floor, brought in a forensics team that dusted every surface for prints, pulled security footage from the building's cameras. The detective, a tired-looking man named Ramirez who'd been handling our case, stood in Walter's office with his arms crossed, explaining that whoever did this had used the emergency stairwell to avoid the main cameras, but there should be key card data showing who accessed the building over the weekend. Walter's assistant pulled the records while we all waited in the conference room, the 7 men separated from us women like we were opposing teams in some horrible game. The key card data showed that 4 people had been in the building over the weekend. Walter himself on Saturday morning, saying he'd come to catch up on emails. Our IT guy, Paul, on Saturday afternoon for scheduled server maintenance. Junior architect Colin on Sunday evening to grab files he'd forgotten. And surprisingly, Richard, our 60-year-old structural engineer who said he'd been meeting a client. Each of them had perfectly reasonable explanations, documentation to back up their stories, alibis that couldn't quite be verified but couldn't be disproven either. The security footage was useless, showing nothing but empty hallways and closed doors, the stairwell cameras conveniently experiencing a glitch during the crucial hours. It was like watching someone play chess when you could only see half the board, knowing they were making moves you couldn't track. That afternoon, Walter made an executive decision. He sent all the women home with full pay, said we could work remotely while they sorted this out, installed new security cameras in every hallway and common area. The men would continue coming to the office, he said, where they'd be under constant surveillance. He hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage cases. She interviewed each of the weekend visitors multiple times, pushing for inconsistencies, checking their devices, examining their home computers with signed consent that they couldn't refuse without looking guilty. Paul broke first, not because he was guilty, but because the stress gave him a panic attack so severe they had to call an ambulance. Colin threatened to sue for harassment. Richard just sat there during each interview with this eerily calm expression, answering every question in measured tones. The breakthrough came from the last place anyone expected. The building's cleaning lady, Maria, who came in Sunday nights, reached out to Priya after hearing about the investigation. She said she'd seen something odd weeks before the first camera was discovered. Richard in the office at midnight on a Sunday, which she remembered because she'd had to clean around him, and he'd been irritated about it. She'd seen him carrying a small ladder from the supply closet, claimed he was checking the air conditioning vents for a draft complaint. The security footage from that night had been automatically deleted after 30 days, long before anyone knew to look for it. When confronted with this, Richard didn't deny it, didn't make excuses, just smiled this small, satisfied smile, and asked for his lawyer. They found videos on his home computer, hundreds of hours organized by date and person, each file meticulously labeled. He'd been selling the footage online, running a sick little business out of our trauma. He got 8 years, lost his engineering license, his pension, everything. But even now, when I use any bathroom that isn't in my own home, I look up at the ceiling first, checking for little black circles in things that shouldn't have them, knowing that somewhere out there, strangers might still be watching videos of the most private moments of my life. Six months into my job as a compliance officer at Riverside Private Hospital, everything changed on what started as a routine Monday morning. Fresh from my master's program and eager to prove myself, I'd been assigned to review billing discrepancies that everyone assumed were simple clerical errors. The hospital treated celebrities and wealthy families from across the state, and my supervisor had made it clear that accuracy was paramount for maintaining our reputation. My cramped office on the 3rd floor had become my second home, surrounded by stacks of files and dual monitors displaying endless spreadsheets. Most people my age were out partying on weekends while I was cross-referencing insurance claims with treatment records, determined to make a good impression at my first real job. That morning, coffee in hand, I noticed something strange in the cardiac unit's billing from the previous quarter. A patient named George Whitman had supposedly undergone 3 separate angioplasties in a single week, each billed at $47,000. When I pulled his treatment logs from our medical database, only one procedure appeared, performed by Dr. Chen on a Wednesday afternoon. I checked another file, then another, and my pulse quickened as a pattern emerged. Dozens of patients showed multiple expensive procedures in billing that didn't exist in the actual medical records. Some patients had been discharged days before their supposed surgeries. Others had never even been admitted to the units where these procedures allegedly took place. By noon, I documented over 200 fraudulent claims totaling nearly $8 million. The fake entries followed a sophisticated pattern, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic insurance review. Someone had created phantom patient IDs that existed only in the billing system, complete with fake social security numbers and addresses that led to vacant lots or abandoned buildings. Each fraudulent claim was approved by the same sequence of administrators, their digital signatures appearing on documents for procedures that never happened. The money trail disappeared into a maze of department budgets and external vendor payments that would take weeks to fully untangle. I printed everything, my heart racing as page after page confirmed what I was seeing wasn't a mistake, but deliberate, systematic fraud. I spent the rest of that afternoon triple-checking my findings, creating backup files on my personal laptop and a flash drive I kept in my purse. The scope of this was beyond anything I'd imagined when I took this job. Whoever orchestrated this understood our system's blind spots perfectly, exploiting the gap between medical records and billing that existed because the two databases didn't automatically sync. They knew exactly how long they had before monthly reconciliation reports were generated, and they'd been careful to spread the fraud across different departments to avoid detection. My supervisor, Michael Thornton, was out of town until tomorrow, so I decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around 7 that evening, alone in the office with only the emergency lighting in the hallways, I heard footsteps approaching my door. Dr. Harrison, our chief medical officer, appeared in my doorway wearing his golf clothes instead of his usual suit. He rarely stayed past 4, and I'd never seen him on this floor before. He glanced at the papers spread across my desk, then at my computer screen still displaying billing records, and asked what was keeping me so late. His voice was casual, but his eyes moved quickly across my workspace, taking in every detail. I told him I was working on routine audits, trying to keep my voice steady while discreetly closing my laptop. He nodded slowly, mentioned something about dedication being admirable in young employees, then suggested I should head home and get some rest. After he left, I waited 10 minutes before gathering everything and leaving through the back stairwell. The next morning, Michael Thornton was already in his office when I arrived at 8, even though his assistant had said he wouldn't be back until afternoon. He called me in immediately, closing the door with a deliberate click that made my stomach tighten. His usually friendly demeanor was replaced by something I couldn't quite read as he gestured for me to sit in the chair facing his desk. The blinds were drawn, unusual for him, casting the room in a dim yellow glow from his desk lamp. He asked me about my audit findings, specifically mentioning the cardiac unit, which I hadn't told anyone about yet. When I started to explain what I'd discovered, he held up his hand and pulled out a thick folder from his drawer. Inside was my employment contract, with the non-disclosure agreement highlighted in yellow, along with printed screenshots of my computer activity from yesterday. Michael leaned back in his chair and explained, in a tone like he was discussing the weather, that Riverside had certain financial arrangements that kept the hospital running and able to provide excellent care. These arrangements, he continued, were approved at the highest levels, including by our biggest donor, James Fitzgerald, who also happened to chair the board of directors. The fraudulent billing I'd discovered wasn't fraud at all, he insisted, but a complex financial structure designed to offset operational costs that insurance companies refuse to cover. He showed me a document with my digital signature, supposedly authorizing these transactions, though I'd never seen it before. The timestamp showed it was created yesterday evening, after I'd left the office. He said I had two choices: continue my work focusing on other departments and receive a substantial raise, or persist with this investigation and face legal action for violating my NDA and potentially embezzling funds myself, given my signature on these documents. I sat there, feeling the walls of that office press closer as he outlined how my career would end before it started if I didn't cooperate. He mentioned that young professionals sometimes misunderstood complex healthcare financing, that my student loans of $70,000 must be a burden, and that Riverside valued employees who showed discretion. The raise he offered was more than double my current salary, enough to pay off my loans in 2 years instead of 10. All I had to do was delete my files, forget what I'd seen, and focus on other areas of compliance. He gave me until the end of the day to decide, though we both knew there was only one answer he'd accept. As I stood to leave, he added that Fitzgerald's influence extended far beyond Riverside, that every hospital in the state relied on his donations, and that making an enemy of him would ensure I'd never work in healthcare again. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, mechanically going through motions while my mind raced through options that all seemed to lead nowhere good. During lunch, I walked to my car and retrieved the flash drive from my purse, planning to mail it to a journalist I'd found who specialized in healthcare fraud. But when I reached the post office, a security guard from Riverside was standing by the entrance, casually scrolling through his phone. He looked up, made eye contact, and nodded at me with a slight smile. I turned around and went back to the office, the flash drive burning like a weight in my pocket. By 4 o'clock, I hadn't given Michael an answer, so I quietly packed my personal items into a box, left my company laptop on my desk, and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. The security guard at the main entrance made a phone call as I passed, and I knew they were tracking every move I made. That evening, I stayed with my friend Ashley, too paranoid to go back to my apartment alone. I'd told her I was having issues at work but couldn't elaborate, and she didn't push for details. Around midnight, she woke me up to show me an email from Riverside's HR department that had been sent to all staff. It announced my immediate resignation for personal reasons and thanked me for my contributions during my brief tenure. My company email had already been deactivated, and when I checked my bank account, my final paycheck had been deposited with an additional month's severance I hadn't agreed to. Ashley asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I just stared at the screen, realizing they'd already written me out of the story. The next morning, she drove me to my apartment to get some clothes and important documents. The door to my apartment was closed but unlocked, something I would never do. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed at first glance, but small things were wrong in ways that made my skin prickle. My laptop was gone from the kitchen table where I'd left it, though the power cord remained plugged into the wall. The flash drive I'd hidden inside an old shoebox in my closet had vanished, along with all the printed documents I'd stuffed under my mattress. Even my personal files, tax returns, and bank statements had been carefully removed from my filing cabinet. But they'd left other things untouched: my jewelry box, my television, making it clear this wasn't a regular burglary. On my refrigerator, held by the same magnet I used for grocery lists, was a printed copy of my NDA with certain sections circled in red ink. Ashley grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. We filed a police report that afternoon, though the officers seemed oddly uninterested when I mentioned my employer's name. They took notes, said they'd investigate, but their expressions suggested this would go nowhere. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My credit card was flagged for suspicious activity I hadn't made. My phone would ring with silence on the other end, and 2 different apartment applications were rejected without explanation. When I finally reached out to that journalist about the story, she told me her editor had killed the investigation after a call from Fitzgerald's lawyers threatening a defamation suit. I realized then that fighting this would mean losing everything, that they'd already won by making the cost of truth too high to pay. So I did what they wanted. I stayed quiet, moved to a different state, and started over in a field that had nothing to do with healthcare. Sometimes I check the news to see if Riverside ever gets exposed, but 3 years later, they're still operating, still billing insurance companies for procedures that never happen, and probably destroying anyone else who gets too close to the truth. It happened during a time when I thought my life had finally stabilized. I had been working at a medium-sized manufacturing company in Pennsylvania for a few years, handling internal audits and supplier payments. Nothing glamorous, but steady, predictable work, the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing every number matches. My supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, liked to joke that I was married to spreadsheets. I took pride in being meticulous, maybe too much for my own good. That habit is what started all of this. One afternoon, while cross-checking vendor invoices for a quarterly report, I noticed a small repetition in our payment log. The same invoice number appeared twice, 2 weeks apart, for the same amount. I figured it was a copy error and dug deeper. That is when I found 3 more, same structure, same formatting, but tied to supplier names I did not recognize. When I tried to look up their registration details, the company database said the vendors did not exist. No address, no tax record, nothing. Just blank entries sitting in our system like ghosts. I mentioned it quietly to Mr. Caldwell, not accusing, just trying to understand. He gave a small laugh, one of those dry ones that sound more like a dismissal than amusement. "Glitch in the software," he said, waving his coffee mug as if that settled it. "The system pulls old test data sometimes. Just clear the duplicates." I wanted to believe him, but his tone carried something offhand, too casual for someone whose department might be mishandling thousands of dollars. Still, I nodded and went back to my desk. The next morning, my access to the shared accounting drive was gone. I could not open the supplier logs, could not even reach the folders I worked on every day. I thought it was an IT error and emailed the support desk. By the time they got back to me, the logs had been updated. Someone had altered the audit trail to show that I was the one who created the duplicate invoices. My name, my ID, even my approval signature were attached to every single fake supplier entry. I remember sitting there staring at the screen trying to understand how a file I never touched could bear my credentials so perfectly. I went straight to Caldwell's office, but he was not there. His desk was cleared out except for a single coffee ring on the corner. No one seemed to know where he went, or maybe they were told not to talk. By noon, Human Resources called me in for a quick chat. The manager, Mrs. Halloran, said they had received an internal report of fraudulent entries in the accounts payable system, entries connected to my login. I tried to explain what I had discovered, how I had flagged the duplicates and was told it was a glitch, but her expression tightened. She said she could not discuss the details while there was an ongoing investigation. That afternoon, I tried to access my personal files on the local drive, but half of them were missing. Someone had replaced my working folder with an older version that made me look careless, like I had been hiding data. I checked the log timestamps and noticed they matched the same window when my account had been disabled the day before. I called IT again, and this time the technician hesitated before speaking. He said quietly, "Your name was flagged for manual monitoring. I should not even be talking to you." That was when I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was an orchestrated setup. I spent the next evening combing through every backup I had kept on my flash drive at home, every invoice, every supplier record, but even my offline copies were tampered with. The metadata showed edits I never made, dated for times when I was not even at the office. It felt impossible, like someone had remote access to everything I touched. I started documenting my findings, printing out each version, hoping to piece together a timeline that could clear my name. But with each step forward, another piece of evidence surfaced against me, stronger than before. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective with the local police department. He said they had received a formal complaint from my company, accusing me of embezzlement and data manipulation. When I told him I was about to report the same crime but from the other side, there was a pause. He asked me to come in for questioning. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of printouts. My name, my initials, my approval stamps, all perfectly forged. It was like watching my own identity rewritten by invisible hands. At the police station, the detective showed me printed emails supposedly sent from my company account. Each one approved payments to those phantom suppliers. The tone of the messages even sounded like me. Same phrasing, same punctuation habits. I pointed out that the timestamps did not match my work hours and that the email headers could be forged, but he only nodded, saying they would verify everything. I could tell by his expression that he thought I was guilty before I even sat down. The weight of something I did not do was already closing in around me. When I left the station, my phone buzzed non-stop with messages from coworkers. Some offered sympathy, others avoided saying anything direct. Then I got one that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. It was from an unknown number. You should have left it alone. No name, no context. Just that line. I deleted it immediately, but I could not shake the thought that whoever had sent it was close. Someone inside the same building. Maybe someone I saw every day. I began to realize this was not just about money. It was about control. About making someone disappear without physically touching them. In the days that followed, my bank accounts were frozen. The company suspended me pending investigation, and my access badge stopped working. Friends from the office stopped answering calls. The more I tried to defend myself, the deeper the hole seemed to get. Even the detective said it looked like I was trying to rewrite the narrative. The irony almost made me laugh. Everything I did to prove my innocence became more evidence of guilt. I barely slept, waiting for the knock on my door that could come at any moment. Eventually, I hired an independent forensic analyst, someone outside the company. It took months, but he found traces of a remote access tool installed through an internal maintenance update, the same patch that my department had been told to approve the week before everything began. When the report went public, the company quietly dropped the charges. No apology, no admission, nothing. I moved states shortly after. To this day, I keep every login on a separate device and never stay logged in anywhere longer than I need to. Because I know now, once someone decides to rewrite your history, they can make it look like you were never innocent to begin with. The night shifts at the old corporate building were supposed to be easy money. The place had been empty for years, waiting for a renovation project that never seemed to start. My job was simple: Walk the halls every hour, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye on the cameras. The company that hired me had a reputation for stretching their budget, which explained why the only working lights flickered like they were gasping for life. Still, it beat standing outside in the cold guarding construction sites, and I could bring my own coffee and music. The building was massive, 5 floors of cubicles, boardrooms, and forgotten offices. The kind of place where you could still smell old printer ink and stale coffee in the walls. Every sound carried in the emptiness, the hum of the vents, the buzz of the lights, even the echo of my own boots on the tile. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, log the times, check the cameras, and sometimes sit by the main desk scrolling through my phone. But then small things started happening that made me feel like the building wasn't completely asleep. It began with the motion sensors. The system would ping randomly, showing movement in areas I had already locked. Most nights it happened on the 3rd floor, which didn't bother me too much at first. I figured it was rats, maybe even drafts setting off the sensors. But after a week, I noticed something strange in the logs. Every single alert came from the same spot, a corridor near the old executive offices where the doors had been sealed off years ago. The maintenance guy once told me that floor had been shut down after an accident, though he wouldn't say what kind. By the end of that week, the static on my radio began acting up too. At first it was just faint white noise, but soon it sounded like someone whispering through it. I'd switch channels thinking it was interference, but it always came back. The weirdest part was that sometimes, only for a second, I'd swear I heard my name. Eddie. Clear as day, right before the static cut out completely. I tried to laugh it off, but it's hard to stay calm when you hear your own name echo through an empty building. The following night, I made a note to check the cameras every time the motion alert came through. Around 2 in the morning, the monitor flickered, and one of the feeds blinked to black before coming back online. The timestamp matched the sensor trip. 3rd floor, east corridor. The feed only showed the sealed door at the end of the hallway, but something about the frame looked different. There was a faint shimmer on the glass panel, like the reflection of someone moving just out of view. When I went up there to check, the air felt heavy, and the light above the door buzzed like a wasp caught inside it. The tape around the frame was intact, though. Nothing looked disturbed. I started leaving my patrol for last on that floor. I told myself it was to save time, but the truth is I wanted to get it over with. The elevator made it worse. Every time I reached for the button, I'd see the faint smear of fingerprints on the inside mirror, like someone had been pressing their hand there. I was the only one with access after dark. Still, the prints would reappear by the next night. Once, I wiped them clean and watched through the camera feed later. Around 3:20, the elevator doors opened on their own and stayed that way for 10 seconds before closing again. By the 4th week, I could barely concentrate. My coffee went untouched most nights, and I kept the radio volume low just so I wouldn't have to hear the static creeping back in. Then one night, right before my shift ended, the elevator lights blinked. I heard the chime echo through the empty lobby. The display showed it stopping on the 3rd floor. I froze in place, watching as the numbers lingered there longer than usual. No one came down. After a minute, it started moving again, but instead of going to the lobby, it went up to the 5th floor. I took the stairs that night. The building's maintenance logs were stored in the small office behind reception. Out of curiosity, I checked the folder marked incidents. Most of it was dull, water leaks, power issues, but one report stood out. It was dated almost 15 years ago and mentioned a fire on the 3rd floor. A technician had died after getting trapped in the ventilation shaft. They said the area was sealed after that for safety reasons. The report ended with a note saying the elevator had malfunctioned during the evacuation. When I read that, I felt a chill crawl through me. Every time that elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, it was at the same time the fire had broken out. The next evening, I told myself I would ignore it. I turned off the elevator camera feed, left the volume on my radio low, and tried to focus on my route. But around the same time as always, the elevator chime rang again. I stared at the panel on the security desk. It had stopped on the 3rd floor. I hesitated, then picked up my flashlight and took the stairs. The moment I reached the 2nd floor landing, I heard the faint hum of machinery above me, like the air system had come alive for the first time in years. My flashlight beam shook as I reached the 3rd floor door. The tape across it was torn clean through. I opened it just far enough to see inside. The hallway was darker than the rest of the building, and a layer of fine dust covered the floor, except for a single trail of footprints leading toward the end of the corridor. They stopped right in front of the sealed office door, the one that showed up on the motion sensors. My chest tightened when the radio on my shoulder hissed again. This time, the voice came through more clearly. It said my name again, once, then twice, before fading out. The air smelled faintly like burned plastic. When I stepped back, the lights above me flickered so violently that the corridor strobed white and black. For a split second, I saw someone standing by the office door. A figure, shoulders slumped, wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. I blinked and the hallway was empty again. I ran, leaving the door wide open behind me, my boots echoing through the stairwell. When I reached the lobby, the elevator doors slid open by themselves. The display said 3, then it went blank. I quit the next morning. The supervisor did not seem surprised. He just nodded and said, "That floor still giving you trouble?" As if he already knew. A few weeks later, I drove past the building and saw workers tearing down the front entrance. The elevator cables were hanging loose like veins through the exposed floors. I have worked other jobs since then, but no matter where I go, I still hear that faint static every now and then, like someone whispering through a dead frequency, still trying to say my name. The building where I worked had this strange quiet after 6 a.m. in the evening. Most of the call center agents rushed out as soon as their shift ended, but I liked finishing my reports before heading home. My cubicle was in the corner, next to a window that faced a dark parking lot filled with flickering lights. That evening, the sky looked heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything inside feel smaller. I remember the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft static in my headset, just background noise that made me feel less alone. I had been handling calls for a healthcare hotline, mostly people asking about coverage or waiting times. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My supervisor, Trevor, had left early for a dentist appointment, and the team leader on duty didn't seem to notice I stayed behind. Around 6:40, I saw a few coworkers passing by my row, laughing about something, one of them mentioning a drill over the sound of their chatter. I assumed it was one of those late safety checks they sometimes ran. They were gone within minutes. The floor grew still, and I sank into my chair, typing notes from the last call. My headset stayed on because I liked listening to the recorded prompts. They drowned out the echo of my own typing. I remember feeling oddly calm, almost cocooned by routine. When the power flickered once, I thought nothing of it. It happened sometimes when the maintenance crew tested circuits in the building. The lights dimmed, buzzed, then stabilized again. Maybe 10 minutes later, I noticed a faint smell, like burnt plastic. It was subtle at first, almost chemical, like the scent from overheated wires behind a computer. I looked around and saw nothing unusual. The red standby light on the printer glowed steadily. My monitor stayed bright, and the hallway outside my cubicle was still. I kept working, assuming it was just someone heating leftovers in the break room microwave again. The smell got stronger. I leaned back and took off my headset, realizing the office was far too silent. Usually the faint clatter of keyboards or the distant hum of vending machines filled the space, but now there was nothing. Just that low, uneven buzz from the ceiling lights. I stood up, peering over the cubicle walls toward the main corridor. The emergency exit sign glowed faintly red, and through the frosted glass partition I thought I saw movement, like shadows shifting quickly past the door. Curiosity pushed me closer to the hallway. That was when I noticed a thin trail of smoke creeping along the ceiling. My first thought was that something shorted out in the server room. I hurried to the stairwell door, but it wouldn't budge. The security system must have locked it automatically, which sometimes happened after hours. I tried my keycard. Nothing. A mechanical beep and a solid click that did not release. By now the haze was spreading faster. It stung my eyes and left a bitter taste in my mouth. I ran to the other end of the floor where another exit door was located. Same problem. Locked. My phone was on the desk, and for a second I hesitated to go back. The smoke was thicker near my cubicle. I used my sleeve to cover my face, stumbling back through the corridor. My head was spinning, and I could hear faint thuds somewhere below, maybe from people or heavy equipment. When I reached my desk again, I grabbed my phone and tried calling building security, but no one answered. The signal kept cutting in and out. I sent a text to a coworker, just saying there was smoke and I was still inside. I didn't realize until later that by then, the entire floor below had already been engulfed in flames. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving only the dim emergency glow from the exit signs and the orange shimmer crawling under the door at the far end. I remember grabbing my jacket and waving it near the floor, hoping to push the smoke away just enough to breathe. The sound of the fire alarms finally reached me, muffled through the walls mixed with distant voices. I yelled for help, but my own voice barely carried. The air was so dense it felt like trying to speak underwater. Every step toward the far window grew heavier, the carpet warm under my shoes, sticky from melted plastic. Through the glass, I could see flashes of red, emergency lights reflecting against the neighboring building. I pressed my face close to the cool metal of the window frame, trying to catch a breath. The heat kept building behind me. Then I heard something slam, the main door being forced open from the other side. I dropped to the floor, coughing, as two figures in heavy suits burst through the haze. They shouted something I couldn't make out. Then one of them grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairwell. The next few minutes were a blur of motion, alarms, and roaring noise. The firefighters carried me out through the service stairs, where the concrete walls were streaked black. When the cold air hit my face outside, I barely managed to keep my eyes open. Someone wrapped a blanket around me and told me I had been lucky. The heat sensors had tripped too late. I spent the night at the hospital with mild burns and smoke inhalation. They said I had passed out right before they reached me. Weeks later, I learned that the safety officer responsible for the evacuation had left early that night. He never checked my floor. The company did not say much publicly, only that procedures had been reviewed. I still work in offices sometimes, but I never stay after hours anymore. Every faint smell of burned dust from a heater or a computer cable still brings back that same quiet moment, the one right before I realized I was completely alone in a burning building. Widowhood changes you in ways you never expect, and one of those changes was my decision to stay on the property Glenn and I had built together in rural Montana. He passed 2 winters before that night, and somewhere between burying him and turning 43, I convinced myself that staying made sense. Our nearest neighbors, the Farley family, lived about 3 miles down the county road, and the closest sheriff's substation was in Ridgefield, a good 50-minute drive on roads that turned treacherous after dark. People in the city think isolation sounds peaceful, romantic even, but there is nothing romantic about being a woman alone in a house surrounded by wheat fields and darkness that stretches in every direction. That particular night in early November 2017, I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted from splitting firewood and fixing a section of fence the wind had knocked down. My 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a mutt named Copper, slept in their usual spots by the wood stove. The wind had died down and the house had settled into that deep, consuming quiet that only exists miles away from civilization. I woke to Duke's growl, low and guttural, the kind of sound he only made when something was genuinely wrong. My eyes opened to complete darkness, and for a moment I lay still, listening, trying to separate real sounds from the remnants of whatever dream I had been having. Then Copper joined in, both dogs now at the bedroom window, their bodies rigid, hackles raised in silhouettes against the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I heard it then, distant but unmistakable, other dogs barking somewhere out in the night. The Farleys had hounds, and they never barked like that, unless something had them spooked. I pushed myself up on one elbow, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand, when I saw it, a sweep of headlights moving slowly across my eastern field. Not on the road, but actually in the field, cutting through the harvested wheat stubble. My heart began pounding as I watched the lights move with purpose, methodical, like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Nobody had any business being on my property at. I checked the clock, 2:47 in the morning. I did not turn on the lamp. Some instinct, ancient and primal, told me to stay in the dark. Instead, I slid out of bed and crouched below the window, peering over the sill just enough to watch. The headlights had stopped moving now, parked at the edge of my property near the old grain silo Glenn had never gotten around to tearing down. Then they went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the dogs growling and the distant sound of the Farley hounds still going wild. Then I saw a second set of headlights appear, coming from the opposite direction, from the west where the old logging road cut through the tree line. These lights also moved slowly, deliberately, and they also stopped at the perimeter of my property before going dark. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers finding it in the darkness, and I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and I immediately dimmed it, shielding the glow with my body. No signal. There was never good signal out here, but sometimes I could get one bar near the kitchen window. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, Duke and Copper following close behind me, their nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When I reached the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall beside the window that faced the front yard and the long gravel driveway that connected my property to the county road. What I saw made my legs go weak. A third vehicle was parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights also off, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. They had surrounded the house. 3 vehicles, positioned at 3 different points, and all of them had known exactly where to stop, exactly how to approach without being seen from the road. I checked my phone again, holding it up near the window, watching desperately for even one bar to appear. Nothing. I thought about the landline in the living room, the old rotary phone Glenn had insisted on keeping because cell service was so unreliable. I started moving toward it, staying low, when I heard something that stopped me cold. The distinct sound of a radio crackling somewhere outside, followed by a man's voice, too quiet to make out the words, but close enough to hear the tone. I crawled to the living room, my knees scraping against the rug Glenn's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The rotary phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I lifted the receiver as quietly as I could, pressing it to my ear. Dead silence. No dial tone, nothing. They had cut the line. These were not drunk teenagers or lost hunters. These were people who had planned this, who knew that cutting the phone line would leave me stranded, who understood that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. I set the receiver down and pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. Glenn's shotgun was in the bedroom closet, a 12-gauge Remington he had taught me to use for coyotes that sometimes went after the chickens. I had not fired it since he died, but I knew it was loaded, knew there was a box of shells on the top shelf beside it. I needed to get back to the bedroom without being seen through any of the windows. Duke suddenly let out a sharp bark, and I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, whispering for him to be quiet. Through the living room window, I saw a beam of light sweep across the front porch. A flashlight. Someone was on my porch, right outside the front door, maybe 15 feet from where I was crouched in the darkness. I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, slow and deliberate, and then the light paused at the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold hardwood, holding both dogs by their collars as they trembled and growled. The beam moved across the room above me, illuminating the couch, the bookshelf, the fireplace mantel with our wedding photo still displayed. Then the light clicked off, and I heard the footsteps retreat, followed by that radio crackle again. A different voice this time, deeper, responded with something I could not understand. They were communicating positions, coordinating movements. and they were doing it with the kind of calm efficiency that terrified me more than anything else. I waited until the footsteps faded before I started crawling toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. Every creak of the floorboard sounded impossibly loud, and I kept expecting a window to shatter or a door to burst open at any moment. When I finally reached the bedroom, I eased the closet door open and felt around in the darkness until my fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded by touch alone, and grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. My hands were unsteady as I shoved extra shells into the pockets of my pajama pants. I had no plan beyond this, no idea what I was supposed to do against multiple armed men who clearly knew what they were doing. I thought about hiding, about crawling into the space beneath the bed or locking myself in the bathroom, but I knew that would only delay whatever was coming. These people had not gone through all this trouble just to leave empty-handed. They wanted something, and the only thing of value in this house was me. A sound from the back of the house made Duke lunge forward, barking furiously, and this time I could not stop him. He bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, Copper right behind him, and I heard the back door rattle violently in its frame. Someone was trying to force it open. I ran after the dogs, the shotgun raised, my bare feet slapping against the floor. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the door shaking as someone threw their weight against it from outside. The deadbolt was holding, but the door was old, the wood frame soft from decades of Montana winters. It would not hold for long. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door and screamed at the top of my lungs that I had a gun, that I would shoot anyone who came through. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I heard that radio crackle again, followed by a voice I will never forget as long as I live. It was calm, almost amused, and it said clearly enough for me to hear through the door, "She is in the kitchen, armed, 12 gauge, probably the husband's old Remington." They knew about Glenn. They knew about the gun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost doubled over. These were not strangers who had randomly chosen my house. These were people who had watched me, studied me, learned my routines and my vulnerabilities. I thought about all the times I had gone into town for groceries, all the conversations I had at the feed store or the gas station, mentioning that I lived alone now, that Glenn was gone, that the property was too big for one person, but I could not bring myself to sell. I had told strangers my entire situation without ever thinking twice. The voice outside spoke again, this time directed at me. "Mrs. Hartley, we know you are alone. We know the nearest deputy is 47 minutes away on a good night, and the roads are icy. We know your cell phone does not work out here. We have done this before, and it always goes easier when people cooperate." The casual way he listed these facts, like he was reading from a checklist, made me realize how carefully they had planned everything. They had probably watched the house for weeks, maybe months, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, which lights I turned on and when I turned them off. I backed away from the door, the shotgun still raised, my mind racing through options that all seemed hopeless. The windows were old single-pane glass, easy to break. The doors were solid, but the frames were weak. Even if I shot one of them, there were others, and they would be through the house before I could reload. Then I remembered something, the root cellar. Glenn had dug it himself the second year we lived here, an underground space beneath the kitchen accessible through a trap door hidden under the rug by the pantry. He had installed a heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs, paranoid about tornadoes even though they were rare this far north. The cellar had supplies, canned food, water, a battery-powered radio, and most importantly, it had a lock that could only be opened from the inside. If I could get down there with the dogs, I could wait them out. Eventually, someone would notice I was missing. Eventually, help would come. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan I had, and I was running out of time. I moved quickly, pulling back the rug with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready with the other. The trapdoor was right where it had always been, the iron ring handle cold against my palm. I yanked it open and whistled for the dogs, and Duke understood immediately, bounding down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Copper hesitated, confused, and I had to grab him by the collar and practically shove him through the opening. I was halfway down the stairs myself when I heard glass shatter somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps and voices calling out to each other. They were inside. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, fumbling in the darkness for the steel door at the bottom of the stairs. My fingers found the handle, and I pulled it closed just as I heard footsteps in the kitchen directly above me. The lock was a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would find on a commercial door, and it slid into place with a solid thunk that echoed in the small concrete room. I pressed my back against the cold wall, both dogs huddled against my legs, and I listened to the sounds of my home being torn apart above me, cabinets slamming, furniture being overturned, and then footsteps directly over the trapdoor, followed by the sound of someone pulling at the handle. A voice, the same calm voice from before, called down through the floor. "Mrs. Hartley, that is a very old door. We have tools, we have time. The choice is yours." I did not answer. I sat in the darkness with my shotgun aimed at the steel door. My dogs pressed against me, and I waited. I heard drilling, prying, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I heard voices arguing, urgent now, the calm tone gone. A vehicle engine started somewhere outside, then another. Through the concrete walls, I heard tires on gravel moving fast, moving away. I did not move from that cellar until sunlight began to creep through the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. When I finally climbed out, my house was destroyed. Every drawer emptied, every closet ransacked, furniture overturned and broken. But I was alive. The sheriff found me sitting on my front porch with the shotgun across my lap, and I told him everything. He listened with the expression I could not read, then told me there had been 3 other home invasions in the county over the past 2 years, all isolated properties, all women living alone. 2 of those women were never seen again. They never caught the men who did it. I sold the property 6 weeks later and moved to Bozeman, where I can see my neighbors' houses from my kitchen window. I still do not sleep through the night. I still wake up at 2:47 in the morning, listening for dogs barking in the distance, waiting for headlights to sweep across a field that no longer exists outside my window. Ridgefield, Montana is the kind of place that does not show up on most maps. Population 200 and something, depending on who had moved away or passed on that year. My best friend Haley and I were sent there every summer to stay with my grandparents while our parents worked. And by the time we finished 6th grade, we knew that dirt road to Perkins General Store better than we knew our own backyards. 4 miles of packed earth cutting through wheat fields and abandoned farmland, with nothing but fence posts and the occasional rusted tractor to break up the endless gold horizon. We had walked it dozens of times without incident, 2 12-year-old girls with too much energy and not enough supervision, picking wild blackberries and racing each other to the old Jennings barn that sat rotting at the halfway point. Our grandparents never worried about us making that trip alone, because nothing ever happened in Ridgefield. That was the whole point of the place, the safety of isolation, the comfort of knowing every single face in town. On that Thursday morning in early June, Grandma pressed a $20 bill into my palm and handed me her grocery list, and Haley and I set off like we had 100 times before. The heat hit us the moment we stepped off the porch, that dry Montana summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the road like a mirage. Haley complained about the dust getting into her sandals, and I told her she should have worn sneakers like I did, and we bickered about nothing as we walked. We were roughly 2 miles in when I heard the engine approaching from behind, which meant nothing at first because farmers drove that road constantly. But this vehicle slowed down in a way that made me turn around and look. A dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper and mud splattered across the wheel wells pulled up alongside us, keeping pace with our walking speed. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window, and I got my first clear look at his face. He had thin blonde hair slicked back against his scalp with something greasy, pale blue eyes that seemed too wide for his face, and a smile that stretched his lips in a way that showed every single one of his yellow teeth. When he spoke, his voice came out warm and friendly, the kind of voice adults use when they want children to trust them immediately. "You girls must be the Whitaker grandkids," he said, nodding like he already knew the answer. "Heading to Perkins, I bet. Your grandma send you for groceries?" I remember feeling a small wave of relief at that moment, because he knew our family name, which meant he had to be a local, someone safe. Haley relaxed a little beside me too, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The man kept talking, explaining that he worked on one of the farms further out past the county line and came through Ridgefield every few weeks for supplies. He said his name was Gene, or maybe it was Dean, something short and plain that I cannot remember clearly anymore because everything that came after erased those small details from my mind. What I do remember is what he said next, leaning further toward the open window with that strange wide smile still plastered across his face. He told us there had been coyote attacks on the road up ahead, that a pack had gotten bold and gone after a couple of dogs just yesterday, and it was not safe for two young girls to be walking alone. Haley looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether to believe him. The thing was, coyote problems were not unusual in that area, and we had been warned about them before by our grandfather, who kept a rifle by the back door for that exact reason. So the story made sense, and the man seemed to know that it would. He offered us a ride the rest of the way to the store, saying it would only take a few minutes, and he was heading that direction anyway. I hesitated, feeling something heavy settle in my chest that I could not explain, a reluctance that had no logical source. But Haley was already moving toward the truck, and I did not want to seem like a scared little kid in front of her. I climbed into the cab after her, settling onto the cracked leather bench seat that smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and faintly chemical that I could not identify. The man pulled back onto the road, and for a minute everything seemed normal. Just the rumble of the engine and the dust billowing behind us through the rear window. Then I noticed we were not going the right way. The road to Perkins continued straight for another 2 miles before curving slightly east toward the village center. But this man had turned left onto a narrow side path that led into the overgrown Jennings property. I knew that land well because Haley and I had explored the edges of it many times, daring each other to get closer to the collapsing barn with its dark windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as the main road disappeared behind a wall of tall wild grass, and my heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said this was a shortcut that would get us to the store faster. But that was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because this road led nowhere except deeper into abandoned farmland. Haley grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, her palm slick with sweat. I looked at her face and saw my own fear reflected back at me, her eyes wide and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The man kept talking in that same cheerful tone, telling us about the weather and the wheat harvest and other things that meant nothing, filling the air with words so we would not have time to think. But I was thinking, and what I was thinking was that nobody knew where we were. Our grandparents expected us to be gone for at least 2 hours, and if we disappeared into these fields, no one would even start looking for us until lunchtime. The truck slowed down as we approached the old Jennings barn, and I saw that someone had been here recently because there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and the padlock on the barn door had been replaced with a shiny new one. The man pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine, and in that sudden silence I could hear birds singing somewhere far away and the tick of the cooling motor. He turned to look at us with that same terrible smile, and he said we should wait here for just a minute while he checked on something inside the barn. That was when Haley screamed. It was not a word or a call for help, just a raw animal sound of pure terror that seemed to unlock something in both of us. She yanked the door handle and threw herself out of the truck before I even understood what was happening, and I followed her a half-second later, my feet hitting the ground hard enough to send a jolt of pain up through my ankles. The man shouted something behind us, his friendly voice gone sharp and ugly, but I did not turn around to see if he was chasing us. We ran into the tall grass, pushing through stalks that whipped against our faces and arms, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Haley somewhere to my left, crashing through the vegetation, and I angled toward the sound of her footsteps. The grass was so high that I could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and I kept expecting to feel a hand close around my arm or my hair at any moment. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I did not slow down, could not slow down, because somewhere behind us was a man who had taken us to an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and I knew with absolute certainty what that meant. We ran until the grass thinned out and gave way to a plowed field, the dirt soft and uneven beneath our feet. I stumbled twice and caught myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw against rocks and dry clods of earth. Haley was crying now, loud hiccuping sobs that she could not control, and I grabbed her wrist and pulled her along because we could not stop yet. In the distance, I could see a farmhouse with a red roof and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, and I pointed toward it and told Haley to keep going. My whole body was shaking. Not just my hands, but my legs and my jaw and something deep inside my chest that would not stop trembling no matter how hard I tried to control it. We crossed what felt like miles of open field, exposed and vulnerable under that bright blue sky, before we finally reached the farmhouse and I started pounding on the door with both fists. A woman in her 60s opened it, flour on her apron and confusion on her face, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and desperate, and I could see that she did not understand. Her name was Loretta Grimes, and she sat us down at her kitchen table and gave us glasses of water while she called our grandparents. Haley could not stop crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, and I held her hand across the table while I tried to answer Loretta's questions. I told her about the man in the green truck, about the lie he told us about coyotes, about the turn onto the side road and the barn with the new padlock. Loretta's face went pale as I spoke, and she picked up the phone again to call the sheriff's office in the next town over. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of fear and fury that I had never seen before, and he wrapped both of us in his arms so tight I could barely breathe. The sheriff's deputy showed up an hour after that, a young man with a notepad who wrote down everything I said and nodded seriously but did not seem particularly alarmed. He told us the description matched several trucks in the county and that without a license plate number, there was not much they could do. My grandmother kept saying we should never have been walking alone, that it was her fault for sending us, and the guilt in her voice made me feel worse than anything else that had happened that day. The following weeks were strange and uncomfortable in ways I did not expect. Word spread through Ridgefield quickly, as it does in small towns, but the reaction was not what I thought it would be. Some people believed us completely and praised us for being smart enough to run, but others, including people I had known my whole life, suggested that we had misunderstood the situation. Maybe the man really was just trying to help, they said. Maybe we panicked for no reason and made a nice farmer look like a criminal. One older man at the general store told my grandfather that city kids were always too suspicious, too dramatic, and that we probably scared a good Samaritan half to death by jumping out of his truck like that. The doubt hurt almost as much as the memory of that day, and Haley and I stopped talking about what happened because it seemed like nobody wanted to hear it. We finished out the summer at our grandparents' house, but we never walked to the store alone again. And we never explored the old Jennings property, and we slept in the same bed every night because neither of us could stand to be alone in the dark. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, my mother called with news that made her voice crack and tremble through the phone line. A man had been arrested in Carroll County, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield, after attempting to force a 9-year-old boy into his vehicle outside a gas station. The boy's father had been inside paying and came out just in time to see what was happening, and he held the man down until police arrived. The vehicle was a dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper. When investigators searched the property where the man lived, a rented trailer on the edge of an old farming community, they found things that my mother would not describe to me no matter how many times I asked. She only said that the man had done this before, in other counties, in other states, and that some of those children had never been found. I sat on the edge of my bed in my childhood room, the phone pressed against my ear, and I thought about that barn with the shiny new padlock and the fresh tire tracks in the mud. I thought about how close we had come to being part of a story that ended very differently. A story that might have ended with our photographs on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across Montana. Haley and I are adults now, both of us with families of our own, and we have only talked about that day a handful of times in all the years since. But I think about it more often than I would like to admit, usually when I see my own daughter walking home from school or riding her bike around the neighborhood. I taught her early about strangers and cars and the lies that dangerous people tell, and I made sure she understood that politeness is never more important than survival. She knows that if something feels wrong, she should run first and explain later, and she knows that I will always believe her no matter what anyone else says. The man who drove that green truck is serving multiple life sentences now, locked away in a place where he cannot hurt anyone else. But sometimes late at night when sleep will not come, I still see his face through that rolled down window. I still see those yellowed teeth stretched into that wide, unnatural smile. And I still hear his friendly voice, asking if we were the Whitaker grandkids heading to the store. And I wonder how many other children heard that same voice, saw that same smile, and were not lucky enough or fast enough to escape into the tall grass before it was too late. My cousin got me the job at the grain facility out near Harlow County, about 40 minutes from the nearest town with a stoplight. He worked for the agricultural company that owned the place and said they needed someone to cover night shifts for a few weeks, while their regular guy recovered from back surgery. Simple work, he promised. Walk the perimeter twice a night, log any delivery trucks that came through, check the temperature gauges on the storage bays, and make sure nobody was messing around on the property. The pay was decent for what amounted to sitting in a small office trailer and reading most of the night. I had just finished my teaching certification and was waiting for the school district to finalize my contract for the fall semester, so the timing worked out. My girlfriend thought I was crazy for taking a job in the middle of nowhere, but we needed the money, and 6 weeks of overnight shifts seemed like easy cash. The facility itself sat on about 15 acres of flat land surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides and a county road on the 4th. There were 6 massive grain silos, a long metal warehouse for equipment storage, and 3 smaller storage bays used for overflow during harvest season. The office trailer where I spent most of my time was positioned near the front gate, close enough to the road that I could see headlights coming from a mile away. My first 3 shifts were exactly what my cousin described. Boring in the best way possible. I did my rounds at midnight and again at 4 in the morning, wrote down a whole lot of nothing in the logbook, and spent the rest of my time grading practice tests I had created for the class I would be teaching in September. The only company I had was the security cameras, 8 of them total, feeding grainy black and white footage to a monitor that looked like it belonged in the 90s. The night sounds out there took some getting used to. The grain settling in the silos made these deep groaning noises, and the wind coming across the fields would rattle the metal siding on the warehouse something fierce. It was my 4th shift when I noticed the first thing that seemed wrong. During my midnight round, I walked past Storage Bay 2, one of the smaller units used for equipment and spare parts, and saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading up to the roll-up door. Now that door was supposed to stay locked, and according to the schedule my cousin had given me, no deliveries were expected until the following Tuesday. I checked the lock and it was secure, so I figured maybe someone from the day crew had pulled up there earlier and I just had not noticed the tracks before. I wrote it down in the logbook anyway, the way I was supposed to, and finished my round without thinking much more about it. But when I came back around at 4 in the morning, I noticed something else. There was a dark stain on the concrete pad right outside the bay door, maybe 2 feet wide, like someone had spilled something and tried to wash it away. The edges were still wet. I crouched down and touched it, and my fingers came up with this faint pinkish color. Looked diluted, like whatever it was had been hosed down but not completely cleaned. I stood there for a while, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe one of the day workers had cut himself and cleaned it up. Maybe someone hit a deer on the road and pulled in to check their vehicle. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but something kept nagging at me. Why would anyone wash down a spill at a grain facility in the middle of the night? I took a few pictures with my phone, just in case, and went back to the trailer. I thought about calling my cousin, but it was almost 5 in the morning and I did not want to wake him up over what was probably nothing. The rest of that shift, I kept looking at those pictures, zooming in like I was going to find some answer hidden in the pixels. When the day supervisor showed up at 6 to relieve me, I mentioned the tire tracks and the stain. He was this older guy named Dwight, been working there for 15 years, and he just shrugged and said it was probably hydraulic fluid from one of the tractors. He did not seem concerned at all, so I let it go, but I saved those pictures anyway. 2 nights later, I found the tools. I was doing my 4 in the morning round, walking along the back side of the warehouse where the security cameras did not reach. There was a dead zone back there, maybe 60 feet of space between the building and the fence line that nobody had bothered to cover. I almost tripped over a canvas bag sitting in the weeds near the drainage ditch. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a set of bolt cutters, a crowbar, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. None of it belonged to the facility. I knew every piece of equipment in that warehouse because I had walked through it during my orientation, and this stuff was not on any inventory list. The bolt cutters still had price tags on them from a hardware store I did not recognize. I stood there holding that bag, my heart going a mile a minute, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some random stuff that blew in or got dumped by kids messing around. But bolt cutters and duct tape do not just appear together by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it, marked the spot in my head, and walked back to the trailer as fast as I could without running. I called my cousin that morning after my shift ended. Told him everything, the tire tracks, the stain, the bag of tools. He got quiet for a long time, which was not like him at all. Finally, he said I should keep my head down and not mention any of this to Dwight or anyone else at the facility. He said he would make some calls and figure out what was going on, but in the meantime, I should just do my job and stay in the trailer as much as possible. That advice did not sit right with me. I asked him what he thought was happening, and he just said some of the storage bays got leased out to third parties, and he did not always know what they were being used for. The way he said it made me feel like he knew more than he was telling me. I barely slept that day. I lay in bed at my apartment staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Drug storage maybe, stolen merchandise. I even thought about human trafficking, but that seemed too extreme, too much like something from a documentary. By the time I drove back out to the facility that evening for my next shift, I had almost talked myself into quitting. But I needed that money, and I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting to a bunch of coincidences. That night changed everything. I got to the facility around 9, same as always, and Dwight handed off the keys without much conversation. He seemed tired, distracted, and he left quicker than usual. I settled into the trailer, made some coffee, and started going through my lesson plans. Around 11, I noticed headlights on the security monitor, a truck coming down the access road from the back of the property, not from the main county road where deliveries usually came. That road was supposed to be gated and locked, only used during harvest season when they needed extra access for the big equipment. I watched the truck pull around behind Storage Bay 2, the same bay where I had found the tire tracks. It sat there for about 10 minutes with its lights off, and then it left the same way it came. No one got out that I could see. No one approached the trailer or checked in with me. According to every protocol I had been given, any vehicle on the property at night was supposed to log in with the night watchman. That was literally my entire job. I wrote down the time and a description of the truck, white full-size pickup, no visible plates from the camera angle, and I sat there wondering if I should go check the bay or just pretend I had not seen anything. I waited about an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk out there. The night was warm and still, no wind for once, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I took my flashlight and walked the long way around, staying close to the silos where I could duck out of sight if I needed to. When I got to Storage Bay 2, I noticed the padlock was different. The old one had been brass, weathered and scratched up from years of use. This one was silver, brand new, with a black rubber coating around the shackle. Someone had changed the lock. I put my ear against the roll-up door. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a movie, but I did not know what else to do. And I heard nothing at first, just the metal ticking as it cooled down from the day's heat. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. Voices, muffled, impossible to make out the words, but definitely human voices coming from inside the bay. And then a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately like someone had been hurt, and then silenced. I backed away from that door so fast I almost fell over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to convince myself it was something else. An animal, a radio, anything but what it sounded like. I made it back to the trailer in what felt like seconds, locked the door behind me, and sat there staring at the security monitors with my phone in my hand. I should have called the police right then. I know that now. But I kept thinking about what my cousin had said, about keeping my head down, about how some of the bays were leased to third parties. What if I was wrong? What if I called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? And I lost my job and my cousin lost his job, and I looked like a paranoid idiot. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, arguing with myself. And then I saw movement on the monitor. Someone was walking toward the trailer. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, coming from the direction of Storage Bay 2. He was not rushing, not trying to hide. He walked like someone who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be on that property in the middle of the night. I watched him get closer and closer until he walked right out of the camera's frame, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the trailer door. He knocked 3 times, slow and deliberate. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Through the small window next to the door, I could see the outline of his shape, just standing there, waiting. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost friendly. He said he knew I was in there and that we needed to have a conversation about what I had seen over the past few nights. He said it in a way that made it clear he already knew everything. The pictures I took, the bag of tools I found, the fact that I had been asking questions. He said I seemed like a smart guy, and smart guys understood when it was better to look the other way. He said some people made good money just by not seeing things, and that could be me if I wanted it to be. He never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and I did not say a single word. After what felt like forever, he knocked once more, just once, and then the footsteps moved away. I watched on the monitor as he walked back toward the storage bay, got into a dark SUV I had not noticed before, and drove off using that back access road. I did not finish that shift. The second his taillights disappeared from the camera, I grabbed my keys and walked straight to my car. I did not clock out, did not leave a note, did not call anyone. I just drove. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes back to town. I called my cousin the next morning and told him I was done, that I was not going back to that facility ever again. He did not argue. He did not ask questions, he just said he understood, and that he would take care of it with the company. A week later, I saw on the local news that there had been a fire at an agricultural storage facility in Harlow County. Electrical malfunction, they said. Storage Bay 2 was completely destroyed. No injuries reported, no investigation opened. The facility shut down for repairs and never reopened. My cousin stopped returning my calls after that. We have not spoken in almost 2 years now, and when I see him at family gatherings, he acts like nothing ever happened. Like those 6 weeks just got erased from both our memories. I never found out what was really going on in that storage bay. I never found out who that man was or what happened to whoever made that sound I heard through the door. Some nights I still think about it, lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through everything I should have done differently. I should have called the police that first night when I found the stain. I should have trusted my gut instead of listening to my cousin. I should have done something instead of just running away, but I did not, and now I have to live with that. The teaching job came through a few weeks after everything happened, and I threw myself into work, tried to move on, tried to convince myself that whatever was happening at that facility was not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I will be driving at night and I will pass some industrial building sitting alone in the dark, lights off, nothing moving, and I will feel this cold twist in my chest. Because I know now that there are places like that everywhere. Places where things happen that nobody talks about, and there are people whose job it is to make sure nobody ever finds out. I was almost one of those people. Sometimes I wonder if the only reason I am still here, still able to tell this story, is because I was smart enough to stay quiet and scared enough to run. And I do not know which part of that bothers me more. Rural Kansas has a way of making you feel both free and completely exposed at the same time. When my dad passed in 2017, he left me 47 acres of farmland that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it dirt cheap during the Depression. My wife Sheila and I had been renting a cramped apartment in Denver for 6 years by then, and with our twin daughters about to start kindergarten, the timing felt right. We moved in that September, right around my high school reunion, which made me realize how much time had slipped by since I left that small town as a kid, dreaming of city life. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, almost a mile from the county route, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and a few scattered oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The previous tenant, a guy named Jerry Mullins who helped my dad maintain the place after his stroke, had moved out 3 months before we arrived. The house needed work, but it was ours, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe. The trouble started in late October, maybe 6 weeks after we settled in. We had been dealing with the usual rural annoyances: hunters cutting across the back acres without permission, teenagers using the empty barn for weekend parties, that kind of thing. Sheila found beer cans and cigarette butts near the old grain silo one morning, and that was the final straw for her. She wanted a gate, something solid with a good lock, to keep people from just driving onto our land whenever they felt like it. I agreed, mostly to ease her mind, and spent a whole Saturday installing a heavy steel gate at the entrance where our dirt road met the county route. I bought a thick padlock from the hardware store in town, one of those hardened steel ones that cost almost $40. We each kept a key, and I hid a spare inside the hollow fence post nearby, just in case. That first night with the gate locked, I remember Sheila squeezing my hand at dinner and saying she finally felt safe out here. I believed her when she said it, and I believed it myself. 3 days later, I woke up around 5 in the morning to let the dog out and noticed the gate was wide open. Not broken, not forced, just open, swinging gently in the November wind like someone had casually unlocked it and forgotten to close it behind them. I walked the whole length of that dirt road in my bathrobe and boots, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of what happened. Nothing. No trash, no footprints that I could make out in the dark, no indication that anyone had even been there. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly, even though I could picture myself clicking that padlock shut and tugging it twice to make sure. Sheila gave me a look when I came back inside, the kind of look that said she was trusting me to keep us safe out here. I promised her it would not happen again, and I meant it. That evening I checked the lock 3 separate times before coming inside for dinner, but it did happen again. The following Monday morning, Sheila was the one who found it. Gate wide open, padlock hanging loose on the chain like it had been gently placed there by someone with all the time in the world. This time I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle that had driven right up our road sometime during the night. I followed those tracks almost halfway to the house before they curved off toward the old barn and disappeared into the harder ground near the equipment shed. I searched that barn top to bottom, checked every stall, climbed up into the hayloft where dust hung thick in the morning light. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had definitely been on our property. Someone with a key. I called the sheriff that afternoon, and Deputy Nolan came out to take a report, but he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. "Probably just kids," he said. "Probably someone messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but those tire tracks told a different story. I replaced the lock that same week, drove 30 miles to a different hardware store because I did not want to buy from the same place, thinking maybe somehow someone had gotten a duplicate made. This new padlock was even heavier, a different brand with keys that had a unique pattern cut into them. I threw away the old lock entirely and made sure only Sheila and I had copies this time. No spare hidden in the fence post, nothing. For about 10 days, everything seemed normal. The gate stayed locked, the road stayed empty, and I started to convince myself that Deputy Nolan had been right after all. Maybe it really was just some kids playing a prank, and once they realized we were serious about security, they moved on to easier targets. Sheila stopped checking the windows every night before bed. The girls started playing outside again without one of us hovering nearby. I let my guard down, and that was exactly when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning in mid-November when I walked out to check the gate and found something that made me stop dead in the middle of the road. The gate was locked, completely secure, chain wrapped tight, padlock clicked shut just like I had left it. But it was not my padlock. The one hanging there was silver instead of black, a completely different brand, with a keyhole that my keys would never fit. Someone had come onto our property during the night, removed my lock entirely, and replaced it with their own. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not a prank. This was not teenagers looking for a place to drink beer. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know they could come and go whenever they pleased, that no lock I bought would keep them out. They were sending a message, and the message was clear. This property belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. I cut that lock off with bolt cutters and bought a third one that afternoon, but my hands were unsteady the whole drive home. Sheila wanted to move. She said it plainly over dinner that night, the girls already in bed, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. She said she did not feel safe anymore, that whoever was doing this knew too much about our routines, about when we were asleep, about how to get in without leaving a trace. I tried to calm her down, told her we would figure it out. But the truth was I did not have answers. I called Deputy Nolan again the next morning, and he came out to look at the new lock I had cut off, turning it over in his hands like it was a curiosity rather than evidence. He said there was not much he could do without catching someone in the act. No crime had technically been committed, no theft, no property damage beyond the locks themselves. He suggested we install cameras, maybe motion lights, something to discourage whoever was doing this. It felt like being told to solve my own problem, but I did not know what else to do. That night I ordered 2 trail cameras online, the kind hunters use to photograph deer, and paid extra for overnight shipping. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, and I spent most of that afternoon mounting them. One pointed directly at the gate, hidden inside a wooden birdhouse I nailed to a tree about 20 feet back, and another aimed at the dirt road from the corner of our front porch. They were motion-activated, designed to capture clear images even in total darkness using infrared. I tested them a dozen times, walking back and forth in front of each one until I was satisfied they were working perfectly. Sheila watched me from the kitchen window the whole time, and when I came inside, she hugged me longer than usual. We both knew that whatever those cameras captured might change everything. That night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if the motion alerts had triggered. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, quiet, still. The gate locked tight every morning when I walked out to check. By Friday, I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves had scared whoever it was away. If just knowing they were being watched was enough to make them stop. I should have known better than to hope for something that simple. Saturday morning, I woke up to 3 motion alerts on my phone, all time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mouth went dry before I even opened the app. The first image showed headlights approaching the gate from the county route, just 2 bright circles floating in the darkness. The second image was clearer. A pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe blue or green, parked right in front of the gate with its engine still running. I could see exhaust rising in the cold air, caught by the infrared flash. The third image is the one that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stay there for a long time. A man stood at the gate, his back to the camera, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was not cutting the lock. He was not forcing anything. He had a key in his hand, and he was unlocking my gate the same way I did every single day, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. The camera caught him mid-motion, his arm extended, the lock already open in his other hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. I showed Sheila the photos and watched her face go pale. She asked me if I recognized the truck, and I told her I did not. But something about it nagged at me. The shape of it, the way the tailgate sat slightly crooked like it had been bent in an accident years ago. I spent the next hour going through every image the cameras had captured, frame by frame, looking for anything that might help identify this person. The camera near the house had triggered too, showing the same truck driving slowly up our road, headlights off now, moving like a shadow through the darkness toward the barn. There were 6 images total of the vehicle parked behind the equipment shed, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before it turned around and left the same way it came. 40 minutes. This person had been on our property for 40 minutes while my wife and daughters slept in their beds, while I lay dreaming not 200 yards away. I called Deputy Nolan again, and this time he actually sounded interested. He asked me to email him the photos, said he would run the truck through some databases, see if anything came up. But I was done waiting for the sheriff to solve this. I needed to find out who this was myself. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the diner where most of the old-timers gathered for breakfast. I figured if anyone knew about a dark pickup truck with a crooked tailgate, it would be someone who had lived in this county their whole life. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, then started asking questions as casually as I could. Mentioned I was looking for someone who might do some work on my property, someone who knew the area well. A woman named Betty who worked the register overheard me and asked which property I was talking about. When I told her, she got quiet for a second before saying I should talk to Jerry Mullins. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Jerry Mullins, the same man who had worked for my father, who had lived on our property as a caretaker for almost 3 years before we moved in. Betty said Jerry had a dark green Ford pickup, older model, with a dented tailgate from when he backed into a fence post years ago. She said he still lived about 15 miles north, in a trailer near the creek, and that he had been having money troubles ever since my father let him go. I did not correct her. My father never let Jerry go. Jerry had simply stopped showing up after my dad got too sick to manage the property anymore. I thanked Betty, left a $10 bill on the counter, and drove straight to the address she gave me. I found Jerry Mullins sitting on a plastic chair outside his trailer, smoking a cigarette and watching the road like he had been expecting someone. The truck was parked right there beside him. Dark green, crooked tailgate, the same vehicle from my camera footage. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not even stand up when I got out of my car and walked toward him. I asked him straight out if he had been coming onto my property at night, and he just took a long drag of his cigarette before nodding slowly, like I had asked him about the weather. He said he still had keys. He said my father had given him copies years ago, back when he was trusted to come and go as he pleased, and he had never seen a reason to give them back. When I asked him why, what he was doing out there in the middle of the night, he looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. I still cannot tell which. He said he had been storing things in the barn. Equipment, tools, some furniture he could not fit in his trailer. He said he figured no one was using the space anyway, and he did not think it would matter. 3 years of my father being sick, then dead, and Jerry had just kept coming and going like the property was still his responsibility. Like nothing had changed at all. I wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to grab him by his jacket and demand to know what gave him the right. What made him think he could terrorize my family like that? Make my wife afraid to sleep in her own home? But looking at him sitting there in that plastic chair, his clothes worn thin, his trailer rusting at the edges, I mostly just felt tired. I told him to give me the keys, all of them, every copy he had ever made. He went inside without a word and came back with a small metal ring holding 4 different keys, each one labeled with faded tape that had my father's handwriting on it. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He handed them over and I stood there holding them, feeling the weight of all those years my father had trusted this man. I asked Jerry if he understood that he could not come back, that this was over now. He nodded and stubbed out his cigarette on the arm of his chair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to scare anyone, that he always came late at night specifically so he would not bother us. Like that made it better. Like the intent behind the fear somehow erased the fear itself. I drove home and told Sheila everything. We searched the barn together that afternoon and found exactly what Jerry had described. Boxes of old tools, a broken generator, some water-damaged furniture stacked in the corner of the hayloft. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just the sad remnants of a man who could not let go of a place that was no longer his. I changed every lock on the property that weekend, installed new deadbolts, and added 2 more cameras just to be safe. Deputy Nolan closed the case without filing charges after I told him I did not want to press the issue. Jerry was pathetic more than criminal, and dragging him through the courts would not undo the weeks of fear we had already lived through. Sheila still checks the gate every morning before I wake up. Sometimes I catch her standing at the window late at night, watching the road, waiting for headlights that I pray will never come again. We talk about selling the place sometimes, starting over somewhere else, but this land belonged to my family for almost a century, and I'm not ready to let one troubled man take that from us. The locks are changed, the cameras are watching, and Jerry Mullins has not come back. But I still keep those 4 keys he gave me, tucked in a drawer beside my bed, where I can look at them whenever I need to remind myself that the thing I feared most was not a monster or a ghost. It was just a man with a key and nowhere else to go. Buying a house on 12 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia was supposed to be the best decision of my life. I had spent my 20s bouncing between cramped apartments in Richmond, sharing walls with people who screamed at each other at all hours, and when my grandmother passed and left me enough for a down payment, I did not hesitate. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1940s according to the county records, with a sagging porch, outdated kitchen cabinets, and a well pump that groaned every morning like it was in pain. But it sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and for the first time in my adult life, I could not hear a single neighbor. I worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, typing up doctor notes in my pajamas, so the isolation suited me perfectly. My closest neighbor was Harold Jennings, an 80-something widower who lived about a mile down the road. We had a deal where I checked on him twice a week and he kept an eye on my property when I was away. By June, I had been living there for 8 months, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. That Saturday started like any other weekend. I woke up around 9, made coffee, and spent most of the day at my desk finishing a backlog of transcription files. For dinner, I made spaghetti and watched a couple episodes of a true crime show on Netflix. Ironic, considering what happened later. Around 11, I took my dog Pepper outside for her last bathroom break of the night. She was a 6-year-old shelter mutt, brown and white patches with one floppy ear that never quite stood upright. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for early June in Virginia, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin. I stood on the porch watching Pepper sniff around the yard, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky, in a way you never see in the city. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Pepper finished her business, trotted back inside, and I locked the front door behind us. Checked the back door out of habit. Went to bed around midnight feeling completely safe. I do not know how long I had been asleep when Pepper started growling. It was not her normal growl, the one she did when she saw a squirrel through the window or heard a car drive by on the main road. This was low and sustained, coming from deep in her chest, and she was standing at my bedroom door facing the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had set her off. Then I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive. Just 3 steady knocks like someone was being polite about it. My first thought was that something had happened to Harold. Maybe he had fallen. Maybe he had walked over in some kind of confused state. He was getting up there in age, and I worried about him. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, Pepper staying right at my heels, still growling that low rumble. The front door had a small window at the top, but it was dark outside and I could not see much. I also had a window to the left of the door that looked out onto the porch, covered by thin curtains. I did not turn on any lights. Something told me not to, some instinct I cannot really explain. So I just stood there in the dark, trying to see through the curtain. Then came another knock, and a voice, a man's voice, calm and friendly. He said his car had broken down about half a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if he could use my phone to call someone for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on these back roads where cell service was spotty at best. But it was almost 2 in the morning, and I was a woman alone, and something about the situation made every muscle in my body tighten. I moved closer to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch to get a better look at who was standing on my porch. He looked normal. That was the thing that made it so hard to know what to do. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain dark t-shirt, average build, short brown hair. He had his hands in his pockets and he was standing a few feet back from the door, not pressed up against it like someone desperate or aggressive would be. He looked like a regular guy who had car trouble. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting all those crime documentaries get to my head. But Pepper was still growling, her hackles raised all the way down her spine, and that dog had never been wrong about people. I had seen her wag her tail at complete strangers, and I had seen her bark at men who later turned out to be bad news. She had instincts I had learned to trust. So instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. I told him I could call someone for him, asked what number he needed. He said he appreciated that, gave me a name, said his brother lived about 20 miles away and could come pick him up. He even gave me a phone number. It all sounded so normal, so reasonable. I had my phone in my hand, ready to dial, when I glanced out the side window again. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a half moon. But my eyes had adjusted to the darkness by then. The man was still standing there, patient, waiting. And that is when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was a deer, we had plenty of those around. But the shape was wrong. It was upright. It was a person, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, heading toward the back of my house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked back at the man on the porch, and he was still standing there with that same calm expression, like he had all the time in the world. He had no idea I had seen the other one. Or maybe he knew exactly what was happening and this whole thing was part of a plan. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying to think. My mind was racing through options. I could call 911, but the nearest sheriff's station was at least 25 minutes away, and I had no idea how much time I had. I could call Harold, but what was an 80-year-old man going to do? I thought about the back door, wondered if it was really locked, wondered if that second person was already testing it. The man on the porch knocked again, a little louder this time, and asked if everything was okay. His voice was still friendly, but there was something underneath it now, a hint of impatience. I told him through the door that I was calling his brother right now, that help would be on the way soon. I was stalling, buying myself time to figure out what to do. I moved quickly and quietly through the dark house to the kitchen, where I could see the backyard through the window above the sink. The second figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the house, and I could see it was a man, bigger than the one on the porch, wearing dark clothes and some kind of cap. He was not even trying to hide anymore. He was just walking toward my back door like he belonged there. I grabbed the biggest knife from the block on the counter. It was not much, but it was something. Then I went back to the front of the house and told the man on the porch that I was not going to open the door. I said I had called 911 and the police were on their way. It was a lie. I had not called yet, but I needed him to believe it. There was a long pause. I could not see his face from where I was standing, but I could feel the shift in the air, like the whole situation had changed in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The friendliness was gone. He said something like, "Come on, I just need to use your phone. Why are you making this difficult?" But it was not a question. It was a statement. And then I heard the back door handle rattle. Not a knock, not a polite request. Someone was trying to open it, testing to see if it was locked. Pepper went absolutely crazy, barking and snarling and throwing herself toward the back of the house. The man on the porch started pounding on the front door now. Not knocking anymore, pounding, and he was saying something, but I could not hear it over Pepper and the blood rushing in my ears. I finally called 911. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking fast, too fast, trying to explain that two men were trying to break into my house, that I was alone, that I needed help right now. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me to stay on the line, that she was sending units my way. But I knew how far away they were. I knew I was on my own for at least 20 minutes, probably more. The pounding on the front door stopped suddenly, and that silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood in the hallway between the front and back of the house, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Pepper pressed against my leg, still growling. I could hear footsteps on the porch, then nothing. Then I heard glass break somewhere at the back of the house. Not the door, one of the windows. The one in the small laundry room that I always meant to put a better lock on but never did. Pepper bolted toward the sound, barking so loud it hurt my ears, and I heard a man curse, and then more glass breaking as he tried to clear the frame. I ran to the laundry room doorway and saw a dark shape halfway through the window, one leg already inside. I did not think. I just reacted. I screamed at him, something I do not even remember, and I swung that knife at his arm. I felt it connect, felt resistance, and he yelled and pulled back out the window so fast he cut himself more on the broken glass. There was blood on my kitchen knife and blood on the window frame, and I was shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what was happening, and I was trying to tell her, but the words were not coming out right. I backed away from the window, expecting him to come through again or expecting the other one to try the front, but for a moment, everything went quiet. Pepper was still barking, but it was different now, more frantic, like she was trying to track movements she could hear, but I could not. I kept switching my attention between the front door and the broken window, waiting for someone to come through, knowing I could not defend both at the same time. Then I heard a car engine start. It was faint at first, somewhere down my gravel driveway, and then it got louder and I heard tires spinning on loose rock. I ran to the front window and saw taillights disappearing down the road, moving fast with no headlights on. They were leaving. I did not understand it at first. I was still braced for someone to come crashing through a door or window. But the sounds outside faded, and then there was nothing but crickets and Pepper whimpering beside me. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher for another 18 minutes until I saw the red and blue lights coming up my driveway. 2 deputies came to the door and I finally unlocked it, still holding that knife, still shaking. One of them was a woman named Hartley, who took the knife gently from my hand and led me to sit down while her partner cleared the house. They found blood on the laundry room window, on the ground outside, and a trail of it leading into the woods where they must have parked their car somewhere out of sight. The deputies told me I did the right thing, that I was lucky, that most people would have opened that door. The sheriff's department investigated for weeks, but never found them. No matching DNA in the system, no witnesses, no abandoned car with a flat tire anywhere near my road. It was like they had never existed. But here is the part that still keeps me up at night, even 2 years later. About 3 weeks after it happened, a deputy called to tell me they had connected my case to 2 other incidents in the county from the previous year. Same pattern. A man knocking on a door late at night with a story about car trouble. A second person waiting in the shadows. The other 2 houses, the people had opened their doors. One woman was beaten badly and robbed. The other, an older couple, the husband did not survive. They had been targeting isolated homes, places where help was far away, places where people still trusted strangers enough to open their doors at night. I never found out if they were caught. I moved back to Richmond 6 months later. I still have Pepper, and she still growls sometimes at night for no reason I can see. When she does, I do not go back to sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a knock that I hope never comes. "14 years of warehouse work in New Jersey had left me burned out in ways I did not fully understand, until I quit. When my buddy Glenn mentioned a seasonal crop management gig in rural Virginia, I jumped at it without thinking twice. My engagement had collapsed the previous spring. I was renting a depressing studio apartment, and the idea of wide-open spaces sounded like medicine. The contract was simple: 6 months overseeing soybean fields for an agricultural company, with a rent-free farmhouse included as part of the deal. I loaded my Ford pickup and drove 5 hours south on a Wednesday morning in early September 2018. The property sat at the end of a gravel road called Hendricks Mill Lane, about 12 miles from the nearest town with a grocery store. The farmhouse itself was nothing special: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But the land stretched out flat and golden under the late summer sun, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first week passed without any trouble. I spent my days learning the irrigation system, checking soil moisture levels, and driving the perimeter of the 300 acres I was responsible for. The nearest neighbor, according to my contract paperwork, was a property about half a mile east, but the county records listed it as unoccupied, owned by some agricultural trust based out of Richmond. I could see the outline of a farmhouse and a large barn from my kitchen window, sitting dark against the tree line. No cars in the driveway, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The isolation took some getting used to, especially at night when the silence became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in bed. But I kept busy, called my mom every few days, and started settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. It was on the 8th night, a Tuesday, when I first noticed the lights. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I glanced out the bathroom window and saw a faint yellow glow coming from the supposedly empty property to the east. A single light, maybe in an upstairs window, burning steady through the darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the trust had sent someone to check on the property, or perhaps a caretaker stopped by occasionally. I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, but I kept thinking about that light. The next morning, I drove the perimeter as usual and slowed down when I passed the eastern boundary. From the road, the neighboring farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as before, peeling white paint, overgrown grass pushing up through cracks in the driveway, a rusted mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. No vehicles anywhere. I parked my truck and walked closer to the fence line, trying to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. The place looked like it had been empty for years. I even checked my phone to confirm what I remembered from the county records, and there it was in black and white. Property owned by Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust. Status unoccupied. Last recorded activity dated back to 2014. I drove back to my farmhouse feeling stupid for even worrying about it. Old houses have electrical quirks, timers on lights, all kinds of explanations. But then it happened again that same night. This time I was sitting on the back porch around 10, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets. when I saw not one but 3 lights come on in sequence across the neighboring property. First the upstairs window, then something on the ground floor, then a light inside the barn. They stayed on for maybe 20 minutes, then went dark one by one in reverse order. I sat there with my beer getting warm in my hand, watching that dark silhouette against the tree line, waiting for something else to happen. It did not. The property just sat there, black and silent, like it had been abandoned all along. I went inside and locked every door, which felt ridiculous given that I had not locked anything since arriving. That night I slept poorly, waking up twice to sounds I could not identify. A low rumble that might have been a vehicle on a distant road, a rhythmic creaking that was probably just the house settling. In the morning I found myself checking the windows before I even made coffee, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The following Saturday I drove into town to pick up supplies and decided to ask around about the neighboring property. The town was called Burkeville, a small cluster of buildings centered around a gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Maxine's that seemed to serve as the local gathering spot. I grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up in a bun. Her name tag said Darlene. When she brought my food, I mentioned I was working the Henderson contract out on Hendricks Mill Lane, and she nodded like she already knew. Small towns are like that. I asked her about the property to the east of mine, the one owned by some agricultural trust, and her expression changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Not fear exactly, more like caution. She said she did not know much about it, that properties changed hands a lot around here, and then she moved down the counter to refill someone else's coffee. I tried asking the guy sitting 2 stools over, a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap who had been eating pancakes in silence. He looked at me for a long moment, syrup still dripping from his fork, and said something I will never forget. Best not to get involved in other people's boundaries out here. I pressed him on what that meant, but he just shook his head and went back to his pancakes. The whole diner had gone quiet, and I became aware that several people were watching me with expressions that ranged from pity to something harder, something like warning. I finished my eggs without tasting them and left a bigger tip than usual, hoping that might loosen someone up. It did not. Outside, I ran into an older man loading bags of fertilizer into a pickup truck, and I tried one more time. I told him I was new to the area, just trying to understand the lay of the land, and asked if he knew anything about the property east of my place. He stopped loading and looked at me with pale blue eyes that had probably seen 70 winters or more. He said the land out there had history, that people who owned it tended to keep to themselves, and that I should do the same. When I asked what kind of history, he just climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had been going on for decades, speaking a language everyone understood but me. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed around 1 in the morning, not quite asleep but drifting in that halfway state, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate, crunching along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I got up and moved to the window without turning on any lights, keeping myself pressed against the wall so I could see out without being seen. A vehicle was rolling past my property on Hendricks Mill Lane. A large pickup truck or maybe an SUV, I could not tell for certain because it had no headlights on. Just a dark shape moving through the darker night, engine barely above idle. It passed my driveway and continued down the road toward the eastern property, then disappeared around a bend. I stood at that window for maybe 15 minutes waiting until I saw it come back the other way. Same speed, same silence, same absence of lights. This time it slowed even more as it passed my house, and I swear I could feel eyes scanning my windows, even though I could not see anyone inside the vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After it passed, I did not go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light off, watching the road through the window above the sink until the sun came up. The morning brought something worse. I walked the perimeter of my farmhouse the way I had started doing every day, checking for anything out of place, and that is when I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt beneath my bedroom window, 2 distinct boot prints, deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. The window itself was about 5 feet off the ground, too high to see in without effort, but if someone stood on their toes or brought something to stand on, they would have had a clear view of my bed. I crouched down and studied those prints, trying to memorize every detail. Work boots size 11 or 12 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. There were more prints leading away from the window, tracking through the grass toward the back of the property. I followed them for about 200 yards until they reached an old irrigation ditch that cut through the fields toward the eastern boundary. The ditch was dry and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years, but the vegetation had been trampled flat in a narrow path. Someone had been using this ditch as a corridor to access my property without being seen from the road. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. A deputy named Womack came out around 4, a tall man with a sunburned neck and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen everything twice. I showed him the footprints, which had dried and hardened in the midday heat, and walked him out to the irrigation ditch. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, nodding occasionally, writing nothing down. When I finished, he stood there looking out toward the eastern property for a long moment before speaking. He said that folks out here valued their privacy, that property lines could be complicated when you had old irrigation rights and shared access roads from decades past. I told him someone had been watching me through my bedroom window, and he said he understood my concern, but that there was not much he could do without more evidence. No crime had technically been committed. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything else happened, but the way he said it made me feel like he was just going through the motions. I watched his cruiser disappear down Hendricks Mill Lane and realized I was completely on my own out here. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom window and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. The next 3 days were quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from a surveyor or someone checking utility lines. Maybe the vehicle without headlights was just a local taking a shortcut who did not want to disturb anyone. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to focus on soil samples and irrigation schedules instead of what might be lurking in the darkness. But on the 4th night, a Wednesday, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Not imagined, not dreamed, real footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the old wooden boards. I lay perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, listening as they moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then they stopped right outside my front door. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, testing to see if it was locked. It was. The footsteps resumed, circling around the side of the house, pausing at each window. I tracked the sound as it moved, living room, kitchen, bathroom, until it reached the back door. Another doorknob test, another locked barrier. Then nothing. Silence so complete it roared in my ears. I did not move until sunlight started bleeding through the curtains, and when I finally got up to check, I found fresh boot prints circling the entire house. Same size, same wear pattern on the left heel. I decided I was done waiting for something worse to happen. That morning, I drove to the hardware store in Burkeville and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. I mounted it on a tree facing the irrigation ditch, angled to capture anyone coming onto my property from that direction. Then I bought a second one and placed it on the corner of my porch, aimed at the front door and the gravel driveway. The clerk who sold them to me, a young guy named Sutton with a patchy beard and nervous hands, asked if I was having trouble with wildlife. I told him something like that. He looked at me for a beat too long before ringing me up, and I got the sense he knew exactly what kind of trouble I was having. That night, I sat in my truck at the edge of the property with the engine off and the windows down, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars I had ordered online 2 days before. Around midnight, I saw them. 2 figures emerging from the barn on the neighboring property, moving across the field in my direction. They walked in single file, staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. I watched them enter the irrigation ditch about 300 yards out, and then I lost sight of them in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to start the truck and flood them with headlights, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until I heard the soft crunch of footsteps near my house. Then I laid on the horn for a solid 30 seconds. The sound shattered the night like a bomb. When I finally stopped, I heard running, fast, panicked, retreating toward the ditch. The trail cameras caught everything. 2 men, faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low, crossing onto my property around 12:15 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see they were carrying something, a duffel bag, maybe tools. I could not tell for certain. I saved the files to my phone and drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles north, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. The trooper who reviewed the footage, a woman named Kendrick with close-cropped gray hair and no patience for small talk, made some calls while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, she told me what the locals had refused to say. The property to the east had been flagged in a federal investigation. Something about illegal cultivation hidden in the back acreage, distribution networks running through rural properties with absentee owners. The agricultural trust was a front, and the people operating out of there had been watching me since the day I arrived, trying to figure out if I was law enforcement or just an unlucky contractor who had wandered into the wrong place. Trooper Kendrick arranged for me to break my lease that same day. No penalties, no questions. I packed everything I owned in under 2 hours and drove north without looking back. I found out later that a raid happened about 3 weeks after I left. Multiple arrests, the whole operation dismantled. Sometimes I still think about those nights alone in that farmhouse, the footsteps circling in the darkness, the eyes watching from the tree line. The countryside had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, so empty and quiet, but the silence was never emptiness. It was just everyone around me holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. At the time, my life felt small and quiet in a way I actually needed. I'd rented a lonely countryside house tucked between fields and looping back roads that only tractors and grain trucks seemed to know by heart. I worked remotely, kept odd hours, and barely saw another person once the sun went down. The house itself was old but solid, with thick doors, narrow windows, and a long gravel driveway that disappeared into darkness at night. Most evenings were spent with a lamp on, the wind moving the trees and the distant hum of insects. I liked how cut off it felt, like the world had decided to leave me alone for a while. That sense of isolation was the whole reason I chose the place. It never occurred to me that someone else might notice how alone I was. The first thing that caught my attention happened late at night, when I was rinsing a mug at the sink and the room briefly brightened. Headlights slid across the far wall, slow and deliberate, not like a car passing through. I stepped closer to the window and watched the beams creep along the edge of the property, then disappear just beyond the trees. It didn't bother me much at first. Farm vehicles move strangely, and the roads around there twisted in ways that didn't make sense unless you drove them daily. Still, it kept happening, always after midnight, always slow. Sometimes the lights would pause, idling somewhere I couldn't see, engine low and patient. When they finally moved on, the darkness felt heavier than before. A couple weeks later, new sounds joined the routine. Early mornings, just before the sky started to lighten, faint clicks and soft pressure came from the front door. It wasn't violent or rushed, more like someone checking a locked car in a parking lot. One morning it was the back door, another time a window frame near the laundry room. Whoever it was never stayed long, and nothing was damaged. I walked the house afterward, heart thumping, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. That somehow made it worse. Locks untouched meant the person testing them knew they could wait. The storm arrived without much warning, rolling in heavy and loud, flattening the fields with rain, and bending the trees until they groaned. The power cut out first, then the cell signal dropped to nothing, leaving the house humming with rain and silence. Candles barely pushed back the dark, and the wind kept hitting the walls like it was trying to listen through them. That was when the headlights came back, brighter this time, stopping so close the glow leaked under the curtains. I stood there realizing something with a clarity that made my chest ache. Whoever was outside hadn't been trying to get in before. They'd been learning the house, learning me, and waiting for the moment when no one could hear me call for help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind and the soft idle of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. The rain masked smaller sounds, but not all of them. Gravel shifted, slow footsteps pressing into wet ground, careful enough not to splash. A shadow moved past one of the side windows, tall and narrow, pausing where the glass met the frame. There was no rush in the movement, no panic. It felt practiced, like someone following steps they'd rehearsed in their head many times. I backed away from the window, keeping to the darker part of the room, trying to control my breathing as the house creaked around me. The first real contact came at the back door. Not a knock, not a bang, just the gentle turn of the handle testing the resistance. Metal whispered against metal. It stopped, then tried again, slower, as if whoever was outside wanted to feel exactly how much pressure it took. I moved through the hallway on bare feet, each board threatening to betray me with noise. The flashlight in my hand shook enough that the beam bounced along the walls. When I reached the kitchen, the handle stopped moving, replaced by a long, thoughtful silence. I imagined someone standing there in the rain, hand resting on the door, deciding what came next. Minutes stretched until time lost its shape. The storm howled, thunder rolling so close it rattled the cabinets. Then the testing began again, this time at a window near the living room. Fingers brushed the glass, slow and deliberate, tracing the edge like they were memorizing it. I crouched behind the couch, phone useless in my hand, and realized how completely cut off I was. No lights from neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but fields and dark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about breaking in fast. It was about waiting me out, seeing how long fear could do the work instead. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The headlights stayed for a while longer, washing the side of the house in white, then finally pulled away. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry and left the house unlocked behind me, gravel crunching too loud under my tires as I drove away. Later, a local deputy walked the property and found nothing but deep footprints pressed into the mud near every door and window. No sign of forced entry. I never went back. Whatever patience had been waiting for me out there didn't need another chance. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whole thing, those headlights, the quiet testing, sat with me like a shadow, one I couldn't outrun. It's easy to tell yourself things like, maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or there's a perfectly logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I still couldn't explain how someone could have learned that house so thoroughly without ever stepping foot inside, or why they'd only been testing, never forcing. There was no conclusion to the nightmare that made sense. No one came forward. No evidence was found. The sheriff's department gave me the usual keep an eye out talk and moved on. But I couldn't. A few months later, I did some digging, trying to find answers, or at least make peace with the strange events. Turns out, a similar pattern had been reported in a nearby town years before. Another woman, renting another old farmhouse, had noticed headlights passing by her home, followed by strange behavior around her doors. She'd left too, but by the time she did, the sheriff had already dropped her case. She was never even given the chance to speak in person, her complaint buried in bureaucracy. Like mine, her story faded into nothingness. I still think about that night. The silence after the headlights disappeared was one of the loudest things I've ever heard. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. I've learned a few things in the time since. How fragile a sense of safety can be. How quickly it can be snatched away. But there's one thing that still haunts me more than anything. Whoever it was wasn't interested in me getting away. They were waiting for the moment when I couldn't leave. And that, more than anything, is what still keeps me up at night. Posting this here feels strange, but the memory still sits heavy with me, and maybe someone out there will recognize pieces of it. At the time, my life was simple and a little worn around the edges, the kind of phase where quiet feels like a solution to everything. I had just bought a neglected rural farm through a county auction, drawn in by the low price and the promise of isolation. The listing described it as vacant for years, a forgotten patch of land with a farmhouse and an old barn leaning into the wind. I imagined slow mornings, manual work, and the kind of silence you can't buy in town. Friends thought it was impulsive, but impulsive felt better than stagnant. The drive out there was long and empty, gravel roads stretching farther than expected. By the time I unlocked the farmhouse door, the sun was already low, turning the fields dull and flat. The first hours were spent opening windows and pushing stale air out of the rooms. Dust coated every surface, but not in the uniform way abandoned places usually collect it. Inside a bedroom closet, shirts still hung on mismatched hangers, sleeves stiff but not decayed. In the kitchen, canned food lined a shelf, labels faded but intact, some arranged with a care that didn't match abandonment. A notebook sat on the table, pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates from only a few months earlier. That detail caught my attention more than anything else, because the auction paperwork claimed no one had lived there in years. I walked room to room, noticing small things that felt paused rather than left behind. A chair angled toward a window, a pair of work boots by the door, a half-used bar of soap. None of it fit the story I had been sold. As evening settled in, the property took on a different tone. Sounds carried farther than expected, each creak of wood snapping sharp in the open air. While unloading tools from my truck, a dull thud echoed from the barn, deep and hollow. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scramble either. It sounded deliberate, like weight shifting. I stood still, listening, counting my breaths without meaning to. The barn doors were shut, chained the way I'd left them earlier. When I walked closer, the smell of hay and damp earth grew stronger, and the noise stopped completely. That silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Later that night, curiosity won out over caution. With a flashlight in hand, I crossed the yard again, beam cutting through tall grass and catching movement that turned out to be nothing at all. Near the barn, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, clear and sharp, leading away from the doors toward the farmhouse. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. The prints followed a path I had walked earlier, then veered off, circling back toward the house. Standing there, I felt exposed in a way that's hard to explain, like the land itself was watching. I locked every door when I went back inside, double-checking each one, even though I knew it wouldn't change much. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sense that the house wasn't as empty as it claimed to be. Morning light didn't bring the relief I expected. The house looked ordinary again, almost harmless, but the details from the night before refused to fade. Over coffee made with bottled water, I went through the notebook I'd found, reading the entries slowly. The writing jumped between mundane notes about chores and sharper comments about noises, doors left open, and shadows near the tree line. One page mentioned someone entering the barn repeatedly, always after dark, always leaving no trace by morning. That conflicted with the official records I'd reviewed before buying the place, so I drove into the nearest town to ask questions. The county office was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of old paper. When I mentioned the farm, the clerk paused longer than necessary before answering. According to public records, the previous owners had left abruptly, citing safety concerns that never made it into formal complaints. No police reports, no inspections, no follow-up visits. It was treated like a quiet relocation, the kind rural families make without explanation. An older man waiting behind me leaned in and said he remembered lights moving across that land late at night, long after it was supposed to be empty. He shrugged it off as trespassers or kids looking for trouble, but his voice lacked conviction. Driving back, I noticed tire tracks near the fence line that hadn't been there the day before. They stopped short of the road, as if someone preferred not to be seen coming or going. By the time I reached the house, The sense of being observed had returned. That afternoon, I focused on clearing brush around the barn, trying to ground myself in physical work. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint smell of sweat and old fabric. In a corner stall, I found a blanket folded neatly, still holding the shape of recent use. There were food wrappers tucked behind a beam, the kind you'd eat in a hurry, trying not to make noise. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to match an abandoned property. As the sun dipped again, the same sounds returned, footsteps shifting above the hayloft. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly against wood and metal, and the movement stopped immediately. Night fell faster than I wanted it to. From the farmhouse window, I saw a light flicker in the barn, faint but unmistakable. This time, I didn't approach blindly. I grabbed my truck keys and headlight swept the yard as I drove closer, flooding the space with harsh white beams. The barn stood open, doors wide, chain cut clean through. No one was inside, but the footprints were there again, leading straight back toward the house. I didn't stay to search further. I left the property before midnight, drove until my hands steadied on the wheel, and didn't return until days later with help. The farm was sold again soon after, quietly, and I never learned who had been living there, or why they stopped the moment I showed up. Returning to the property days later felt different, like crossing into a place that no longer wanted me there. I brought a friend with me, someone practical who didn't scare easily, and we walked the land in daylight. The farmhouse looked unchanged, but the barn told another story. Inside, the blanket was gone, the wrappers vanished, and the loft was swept clean as if someone had taken care to erase themselves. Even the footprints had been smoothed out, dirt dragged flat with something heavy. My friend tried to laugh it off, suggested squatters who got nervous once the place sold. The explanation sounded thin even as he said it. Nothing about the cleanup felt rushed or careless. We spent hours checking every structure, every shed, every line of fence. Near the far edge of the property, hidden behind tall weeds, we found a narrow footpath leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map, worn down just enough to suggest repeated use. Along the trail were small signs of life: a crushed soda can, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, boot marks half filled with dirt. Whoever used it knew how to move without leaving much behind. Standing there, I realized how easy it would be to watch the house from that spot, to wait until lights went out. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like exposure instead. That night I stayed in a motel in town instead of the farmhouse. Sleep came easier there, but my thoughts kept circling back to the notebook and those recent dates. The idea that someone had been living alongside the myth of abandonment unsettled me more than any noise. It wasn't a ghost story or some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Someone had been there, close enough to hear footsteps, close enough to know routines, and careful enough to vanish when attention arrived. The county never followed up, and no one seemed interested in reopening the past. Silence, I learned, can be a form of protection in small places. In the end, I made a practical choice. I listed the farm and sold it without ever spending another night there. I never mentioned the belongings or the footprints, just said the land wasn't the right fit. Sometimes I still think about whoever lived in those shadows and why they stopped when I appeared. Maybe they moved on to another forgotten place, or maybe they learned to stay hidden better. I don't know, and that's the part that lingers. The farm taught me that isolation doesn't always mean empty, and that some spaces remember people long after the records forget them. Moving into that house marked the start of a quieter chapter of my life, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I had just inherited a small place tucked far from any city, surrounded by fields that rolled on longer than my patience for traffic ever had. My days back then were simple: remote work in the mornings, unpacking boxes in the afternoons, and long walks at dusk to clear my head. The town itself looked like something preserved on purpose. One main road, a few aging storefronts and houses spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I told people online I was craving isolation. But the truth was, I needed distance from everything that had piled up behind me. The house wasn't special. Creaky floors, outdated cabinets, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Still, it felt like a reset button I desperately wanted to press. The locals made a point of introducing themselves within my first few days. Always polite, always brief. Names slipped out of my head quickly, but faces didn't, especially the way some of them lingered longer than necessary when we spoke. Conversations followed the same pattern. Questions about how long I planned to stay, whether I worked from home, and what time I usually turned in at night. At first, I chalked it up to small-town curiosity, the kind people warn you about but never really explain. Every wave from across the road felt practiced, synchronized even. One woman, Rachel, who lived 2 houses down, casually mentioned she noticed my porch light stayed on late. She said it with a laugh, but it landed heavier than she probably intended. It didn't take long before people started commenting on my movements before I ever brought them up. Someone at the general store asked if my morning walks helped with sleep, even though I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Another neighbor suggested I avoid certain back roads once the sun dipped too low, offering no reason beyond a shrug and a vague warning tone. The strangest part wasn't the advice itself, but how consistent it was, as if everyone had rehearsed the same lines. Each evening, I caught glimpses of figures lingering near fences or parked trucks that hadn't been there moments before. Curtains across the street shifted whenever my front door opened. I started varying my routine without telling anyone, just to see if the comments would stop. They didn't. The first real crack in my sense of safety came quietly, almost easy to miss. A kitchen drawer I knew I had closed sat open when I returned from a short drive. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and the locks were exactly as I'd left them. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Small things out of place, a chair angled differently, a window unlatched but not forced. When I mentioned it at the local station, the officer listened with a thin patience that felt rehearsed. He suggested stress, settling in nerves, and reminded me that people here respected privacy. Walking back home, I noticed the same parked truck at the edge of my driveway that had been there earlier. Engine cold, tires dusty. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being monitored. Sleep became fragmented after that, not because of noise, but because of the silence pressing in on me. At night, the house made sounds I couldn't quite place, soft shifts that didn't belong to old wood settling. I started leaving objects exactly where I could remember them, down to the angle of a mug handle or the position of a rug corner. More than once, I woke to find those details altered by morning. The air inside the house sometimes carried a faint scent that wasn't mine, like unfamiliar soap or cold fabric pulled from storage. When I asked Rachel if she ever had issues with people wandering onto her property, she paused longer than usual before answering. She told me everyone looks out for each other here, and that I should be grateful for the attention. The sense of being managed rather than protected grew stronger as days passed. People would appear when I returned home, as if alerted the moment my tires hit the gravel. One man I'd never spoken to greeted me by name while leaning against my mailbox, commenting on how late I was compared to usual. I asked how he knew, and he smiled like I'd asked something naive. He said routines matter in places like this, that predictability keeps things peaceful. That word stuck with me, peaceful, because nothing about the way he said it felt calm. It sounded more like a rule than a reassurance. I tried pushing back in small ways, staying out longer, taking different routes, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using. The reactions came quickly. A note appeared on my porch one evening, written in careful block letters, warning me about roads I didn't need to test. Another time, someone knocked just after dark to tell me my back window had been open earlier, even though I'd been home all day. When I mentioned the notes and visits to the authorities again, the response was polite but firm. They said newcomers often misread community concern, and that stirring things up wouldn't help me settle in. The message was clear without being spoken outright. Isolation crept in next, heavy and deliberate. Phone calls dropped unexpectedly, internet outages became frequent, and my requests for repairs were delayed without explanation. I stopped receiving mail altogether for a stretch, even though I saw the delivery truck pass by. The house felt smaller with each passing night, like the walls were inching closer in agreement with the town. I realized then that leaving wasn't just discouraged, it was expected if I couldn't adapt. Outsiders didn't challenge the rhythm here. They either learned it or disappeared from it, and for the first time since arriving, I understood that the house wasn't the thing I'd inherited. It was the test. The turning point came late in the afternoon, when I returned from a supply run and found the front door unlocked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the handle, replaying every movement of my hands before I'd left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the house carried that same unfamiliar scent again, stronger this time. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. It wasn't threatening, not directly. It simply listed times, my usual departure, my return when lights went out. At the bottom, one sentence was written smaller than the rest, reminding me that life runs smoother when everyone agrees on the order of things. I didn't bother calling the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag with only what I could carry: clothes, documents, my laptop, and a few personal items that still felt like mine. As dusk settled in, cars passed my house slower than usual, headlights lingering on the windows. Someone knocked once, firm but unhurried, then walked away when I didn't answer. I stayed still on the living room floor, breathing shallow, listening to footsteps circle the house without ever rushing. It wasn't fear that pinned me there. It was clarity. This place wasn't dangerous in the way people expect. It was organized, and I wasn't part of the system. When night fully set in, I slipped out through the back, walking across the fields instead of using the driveway. The land dipped and rose in uneven waves, my shoes soaking through with dew. Behind me, I could hear distant engines starting, doors closing, but no one shouted or chased. They didn't need to. By the time I reached the main road, my legs burned and my phone had no signal. But the silence finally felt empty instead of watched. I flagged down a passing truck hours later and didn't explain much, only that I needed a ride far away. The driver didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. I never went back for the rest of my things. Weeks later, I received a single forwarded envelope at a temporary address, containing the house keys and a short note thanking me for understanding how things work there. No return address, no signature. I sold the property without setting foot on it again, accepted a price far lower than it was worth, and considered it a fair trade. Sometimes I still catch myself tracking routines out of habit, checking windows twice, listening too closely. I don't talk about that town out loud, but I know this much for sure. Some places don't want you harmed, they just want you compliant.